Favors were binding social contracts that could last a lifetime. In the ancient world, a favor was never just a kind gesture. It was a binding contract, a social transaction sealed without ink or paper, but with something far more powerful: obligation. In early human societies where written law was rare or non-existent, and where currency held little meaning outside of trade, survival often depended on relationships. And at the heart of those relationships were favors. If a man gave you shelter during a storm, protected you from enemies, or fed you when you had nothing, he didn't just help you, he marked you. He placed you into a silent agreement, one you may never have spoken aloud, but one that followed you until the day you died. And sometimes, beyond. In ancient Mesopotamia, the concept of debt was deeply tied to the spiritual and social order. Owing someone a favor was a form of servitude, spiritual, economic, and familial. A man might owe another not just with crops or silver, but with loyalty, obedience, even the marriage of his daughter. The favor became intergenerational. If the debt was not repaid in his lifetime, it passed to his children. In ancient Rome, this was called obligatio, an obligation not merely between friends or allies, but between patrons and clients. A patron might give you land, protect you from a legal charge, or promote your business. But in return, you owed him undying loyalty. You were expected to vote the way he wanted, to speak his name with reverence, to fight his battles if called upon. And if you refused, it wasn't just betrayal, it was social suicide. These favors built the very architecture of Roman political power. Senators rose not only because of merit, but because of how many people owed them. A single favor could become a rope around your neck, tightening slowly over years. In medieval Europe, this system grew darker. A noble might offer you protection from raiders. You'd be grateful, of course, but that protection meant you now lived on his land, farmed his crops, paid his taxes, and in time, your sons did too. It was the birth of feudalism, a system built on permanent, inescapable favors. What began as mercy became hierarchy. What began as kindness became control. But perhaps the most haunting part of all this is how little has changed. In honor-based cultures across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, favors are still sacred social currencies. In tribal Afghanistan, if someone gives you shelter, even for a night, you may be bound to defend them for life. It's called Nanawatai, a form of asylum rooted in Pashtunwali, the ancient tribal code. Turn your back on that obligation, and you don't just dishonor yourself. You dishonor your family, your name, your bloodline. Favors there are not forgotten, ever. The same can be said for Renaissance Italy. Families like the Medici would help artists, merchants, and even rival clans, but every favor came with a thread. You owe us. Not now, not tomorrow, but one day when it matters most. This idea found its way into crime syndicates too. In the Italian mafia, the phrase, "I owe you a favor," is both gift and threat. A don may grant your request, but what he will ask in return may cost you everything. In those circles, refusing to repay a favor isn't just rude, it's lethal. The weight of these social debts has shaped marriages, wars, betrayals. Even literature is haunted by them. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles withdraws from battle not because of military strategy, but because he feels dishonored by Agamemnon, who fails to honor their unspoken contract of respect. A favor breached, a debt ignored, and thousands die because of it. But why did favors matter so much? Because in a world where laws were fragile, favors were law. They were invisible handcuffs, accepted willingly, but impossible to remove. And they worked because they weren't just transactions, they were identity. If you refused to repay a favor, you didn't just lose a friend. You lost your honor, your standing, your place in the tribe. To be called ungrateful in medieval Europe could destroy your name more thoroughly than being called a thief. Gratitude was survival. But here's the darker side. Sometimes the debt was created against your will. You didn't ask to be saved. You didn't ask to be given food when you were starving. But now, you owe. And the one who saved you may come to collect at a moment of their choosing. A Roman general once saved a defeated king, only to demand years later that the king betray his own allies. The favor became leverage. The kindness became blackmail. That's the trap of favors. They wear the face of generosity, but they plant the seed of control, and that seed can grow for decades, silently, until one day Someone looks you in the eye and says, "You remember what I did for you." And you do. Because forgetting would be unforgivable. This wasn't just history. It was emotional infrastructure. It was how power moved without swords, how obedience was bought without chains. Favors were currency in empires with no banks. They were contracts written not in ink, but in memory. And the moment you said thank you, the clock started ticking. Nobles could demand anything in return for a simple act. In times of famine, when fields lay cracked and barren, when bread vanished from the markets, and children cried themselves to sleep with hollow stomachs, the people of medieval Europe turned to the one force that could still summon grain from distant lands, or unlock the food stored behind fortified stone gates: their local lord. To many peasants, these nobles seemed like gods of flesh and blood, owners of the land, masters of life and death. And when hunger threatened to turn villages into graveyards, a noble might offer mercy: a sack of barley, a goat, a week of bread. But nothing was ever free. Not then. Because in the feudal world, generosity was a weapon, a calculated investment. One act of charity could bind a family for life. And that sack of barley? It came with strings that might not be pulled for years. This is the dark truth of power in the medieval age. Nobles could demand anything in return for a simple act. A bowl of soup today could cost you your daughter in a decade. And the worst part? It was legal, customary, even expected. Feudal obligation was a murky contract, never written down, rarely clear, but its shadow touched everything. A noble might help you during a harsh winter. Then, years later, appear at your door to remind you of the debt. And when that debt came due, it might not be coin they wanted. It might be flesh, labor, marriage. They could say, "I want your son to serve in my household as a squire," or "Your daughter will now serve as a maid in my castle," or worse, "She will be wed to my cousin, an old man in need of an heir." And what could you say? Refuse and risk exile, punishment, or starvation the next time hardship came. Even the church, often seen as a moral compass, would rarely interfere. Nobles were the backbone of power, and their rights, both written and implied, were protected by centuries of precedent. In England, during the 13th century, records show instances where nobles used relief aid during famines to bind peasants into lifelong service. In France, some lords forced entire families into serfdom in exchange for temporary protection or food. They called it bargaining under duress, though no one used those words back then. To the commoner, the deal was clear: accept help, lose autonomy. This wasn't just about survival, it was about long-term control. Nobles didn't need to use swords to conquer peasants. They used favors, calculated mercy. They turned kindness into chains, and those chains passed through generations. A girl taken as a servant in 1301 might see her own daughter born into the same role by 1320. One act of generosity, performed in a moment of hunger, could create an entire bloodline of debt. There's a story recorded in the annals of a northern Italian province. A nobleman once gave grain to a starving widow during a harsh winter. Years later, when her son came of age, the noble claimed the boy as a hunting servant, without wage. The mother resisted. The noble reminded her of the grain. When she still refused, her land was seized. In the feudal structure, power did not require violence. It required memory. Lords remembered who owed them, even when the poor had tried to forget. And this wasn't unique to Europe. In parts of feudal Japan, daimyo would offer peasants rice during lean harvests. And then, sometimes decades later, they would call on those same peasants to surrender a daughter for concubinage or domestic labor. Refusal wasn't an option. It was framed not as cruelty, but as honor repaid. Even in Eastern Europe, in the vast Polish-Lithuanian territories, nobles might rescue an indebted family from eviction, only to later demand the daughter marry into their estate's labor force, effectively locking her into generational servitude. These weren't wild abuses of the system. These were the system. This was the invisible economy of favors and fear. And the most disturbing aspect? Many peasants internalized it. Gratitude became submission. They taught their children, "Never forget what the Lord did for us. Obey Him. He feeds us." They stopped seeing exploitation and saw only tradition. Because in that world, when death hovered just outside your door in the form of plague or drought, survival mattered more than pride. And so, the system thrived. Even love became political. If a girl refused a noble's demand for marriage, citing a promised love or a secret engagement, her family could be punished, her father's land revoked, her brother conscripted. So many chose silence, or submission, or both. And yet, history rarely tells their names. The chronicles speak of kings and lords and wars and blood, but they do not tell you about the girl who served in a castle kitchen for 20 years because her father once accepted a cow, or the boy who died fighting in a noble's private feud because his mother took bread during a famine. But they were real as the hunger, as real as the handshake that sealed their fate. So the next time you hear tales of medieval generosity, of nobles feeding the poor or rescuing families from hardship, remember this: every gift had a price, every favor was a hook, and in the silence that followed the meal, someone was already deciding what they'd take in return. Because in that world, kindness was never free. Saying no to repaying a favor could get you beaten or killed. In the medieval world, the concept of a favor was never just a polite gesture. It was a contract of honor, an invisible chain. And if you broke that chain, if you refused to repay a favor that once saved you, clothed you, or defended your family, then you didn't just lose respect. You could lose your life. Because in societies where survival depended on mutual obligation, saying no wasn't simply rude, it was treason against the social code. In feudal Japan, Europe, the Middle East, and tribal communities across Africa and the Americas, the idea of reciprocity wasn't optional, it was sacred. In medieval Europe, when knights pledged loyalty to a lord or were saved from disgrace or death, they owed a blood debt. This wasn't metaphor. If they turned their backs on the one who once raised them up, they could be summoned to a trial by combat or publicly branded a traitor. And public betrayal had its consequences. Refusing to help a former ally in battle, even if you had a good reason, could be spun into accusations of cowardice or oath-breaking. And that didn't just ruin reputations. It justified retaliation. Entire families could be exiled, castles could be burned. In Scotland during the Clan Wars, a single refusal to aid a chieftain who once offered shelter could spark bloody feuds that lasted generations. One record from the 15th century recounts a man who once accepted sanctuary during a famine. Years later, when asked to support a retaliatory raid, he refused. Days later, he was found hanged in the forest. A message carved into his chest read, "Honor unreturned is a curse." In Japan, the samurai code, Bushido, treated obligation as a form of spiritual currency. If a samurai spared your life, gave you armor, or stood by your side in a duel, you were expected to return the favor with equal or greater loyalty. To refuse meant to declare yourself without honor. You became a heinen, a non-person. And that wasn't symbolic. There were recorded instances where samurai who were refused repayment in kind felt so disgraced that they demanded seppuku, ritual suicide, not from themselves, but from the one who had failed them. It was honor through blood, paid in full. The Islamic caliphates had similarly intense expectations around amana, the moral duty of fulfilling obligations. A favor granted to you was considered part of a divine order. If you accepted it and later denied repayment, you were not just breaking trust. You were violating the will of God. In some cases, communities enforced harsh social penalties on those who refused to aid benefactors. Traders who had once been granted safe passage or lent money and later denied their patrons were cast out from caravans, their names blacklisted across regions. In many tribal societies of West Africa, obligations were cemented through oral traditions and witnessed by elders. If you were helped during a drought, a war, or a sickness, that memory became part of your community's shared story. And if you later denied someone who once lifted you up, if you refused to house their sick child, or lend your oxen during planting season, you were called to a council. The penalty? Often a symbolic beating in public. In more serious breaches, exile. But in cases where the betrayal led to death or ruin, revenge killings were not uncommon. Because to betray a favor was to endanger the entire communal trust system. It wasn't about two people, it was about everyone. Even in Renaissance Italy, where politics, patronage, and status ruled daily life, refusing to repay a powerful patron could be fatal. Artists, scholars, and merchants were often lifted into the elite class through the backing of a Medici, a Sforza, or a Borgia. But if you later refused a commission or denied a request from that same family who raised you, you risked being poisoned at a banquet or disappearing in the alleyways of Florence. Loyalty was a debt with no expiration date. And yet, the darkest truth behind these systems is this: the favor itself was never free. From the moment someone saved your life, you were owned. Not legally, not explicitly, but emotionally, spiritually, socially. You were tethered, and many people lived with the constant fear that their benefactor would one day call upon them for a service they could not or would not fulfill. It was a sword hanging over their heads. Sometimes those obligations became manipulative. A nobleman might help a poor farmer by offering food or land, only to demand his daughter's hand in marriage years later. A warlord might save a rival tribe from extinction, only to demand child soldiers in return when the next conflict flared up. To say no was to die ungrateful, but to say yes was to live enslaved. This created a haunting duality. Honor protected you, but it also controlled you. In cultures where law was weak and survival uncertain, social obligation became the glue holding society together, but it also became a weapon. A noose around the neck of anyone who had once accepted help. One chilling example comes from 14th century Russia, where a minor noble was spared execution by a rising warlord. Years later, that same warlord asked the noble to betray his own cousin. When he refused, the warlord invited him to a feast, then had him buried alive beneath the floorboards of the Great Hall. The room was renamed the Chamber of the Unreturned Favor. Even peasants and serfs were not free from these expectations. In village life across medieval France, a blacksmith might loan a plow, or a baker might feed a starving family. These acts were remembered, tracked. If you ever refused the blacksmith when he needed iron from your cousin, or turned the baker away in a year of good harvest, the entire village turned on you. You were a refusant, a denier of debt, a moral outcast. And moral outcasts were fair game, for beatings, for thievery, for worse. And this didn't fade with time. The mafia, for instance, carried this ancient tradition into the modern age. If someone did you a favor, especially without asking, you owed them, forever. Refusing their next request wasn't just impolite, it was suicidal, because honor among thieves is still honor, and dishonor must be punished. We think today of favors as kind gestures, random acts of humanity, but for most of human history, favors were currency, sometimes more binding than law, more feared than kings. Because in a world built on power, survival, and tribal allegiance, repaying a favor wasn't about gratitude. It was about staying alive. So the next time someone says, "You owe me one," remember, that phrase once held the weight of life and death. And in the eyes of history, a broken obligation could leave you not just friendless, but buried. You could be dragged into a blood feud you had nothing to do with. You help someone once. Maybe you give them shelter. Maybe you hide them from danger. Maybe you offer food, protection, or silence. You think it ends there. But in the ancient world, it doesn't. Because now, whether you realize it or not, you've stepped into a blood feud. You've been branded, not by law, but by honor. And you may have just inherited someone else's enemies. In many societies across history, a favor wasn't just a favor. It was a bond, a vow, a silent agreement that, if called upon, you would stand beside the person you helped, even if it meant spilling blood, even if it meant killing someone you'd never met, even if it meant turning on your own kin. In tribal Albania, it was called the kanun, a code so strict that if someone murdered your cousin, your entire family line was now bound to retaliate. Not just the victim's brother or son, everyone, even distant relatives, even if you didn't know the man who died. Now imagine, you were only the neighbor who offered him a drink the day before he died, but your gesture, your kindness made you part of his story, and now you're expected to pick up the knife. This was no isolated custom. In medieval Corsica, in the Scottish Highlands, in feudal Japan, in the Balkans, in the Arabian Desert, and even among Appalachian clans in early America, favors could bind you to feuds. The moment you gave loyalty, even accidentally, you stepped into a centuries-old war. You became part of a vendetta you never started. And sometimes you weren't even given a choice. Let's go back to Sicily in the 17th century. A man's brother is ambushed and murdered by a rival clan. He gathers his friends, not because they are involved, but because they once hunted with him or shared bread. Now, they're expected to avenge him. If they refuse, they dishonor not only the dead, but themselves. The bond of obligation was stronger than law, stronger than logic. It was blood for blood, debt for debt. It didn't matter if the original cause was forgotten. What mattered was who owed whom. One favor, one alliance, one whispered promise. That's all it took to drag you into someone else's war. And sometimes, the favor wasn't even between equals. In ancient Arab Bedouin culture, if a man sought refuge in your tent and you granted him protection, even unknowingly, you became his guardian, even if he had murdered someone, even if the tribe chasing him demanded justice. If you turned him over, you brought dishonor. But if you protected him, you invited vengeance. Whole tribes were destroyed this way, over a moment of hospitality, because once you gave it, it could not be taken back. And what about Japan? In the era of the samurai, loyalty was everything. If your master was killed, you were expected to avenge him, even if it meant breaking the law and being executed. This wasn't optional. It was honor. It was the code of giri, duty. The 47 Ronin became legends because they waited patiently for their moment of revenge, knowing it would cost them their lives. They didn't kill out of rage. They killed because they owed. And that concept of owing blood for loyalty crossed continents. In 14th century Montenegro, if a man took in a fugitive, the obligation to protect that man extended to his children. If that fugitive was later caught and killed, his family could demand blood compensation from the family of the protector, not the killer, the protector. So imagine this. You shelter someone from a storm. He leaves. Months later, he's murdered. Now, you are expected to avenge him, or else his clan comes for you. Why? Because you gave him protection. And in the world of blood feuds, that's as binding as a brotherhood. You didn't have to draw the first blade. You didn't have to make the first threat. But once the ritual of debt began, there was no neutral ground. Silence could be betrayal. Refusal could be death. Favors were not favors. They were contracts, and the currency was blood. Sometimes, families kept lists, names of those who had helped them in the past. And when the time came, they would show up at your door and ask you to return the kindness. And no was not an answer. Because once you accepted help, once you gave loyalty, once you lit the fire of obligation, it burned until death. Even in Europe, the idea persisted. In Icelandic sagas, men swore oaths over graves and mead, binding their fate to another man's revenge. They would wait years, decades, if needed. But eventually the sword came down. So you see, in the old world, you couldn't simply mind your business. You couldn't help and then walk away, because favors echoed, and those echoes could kill. Sometimes, it wasn't about revenge at all. It was about honor. You weren't killing because someone hurt you. You were killing because they hurt someone you were bound to, someone you protected, or fed, or traveled with. That was enough. And even if the feud died down, it didn't disappear. It went dormant, waiting, until a wedding, a birth, a drunken insult. And suddenly, you're standing in a street, blade drawn, facing a stranger with your last name on his list. Not because of what you did, but because of who you helped. So the next time you think of history as kings and battles, remember this. Some of the bloodiest wars were never written in books. They were written in whispers, in debts, in cups of wine, in doorways, in small moments of mercy. And sometimes, that mercy became your death sentence. Monks might demand land in exchange for healing or shelter. In the medieval world, survival was a quiet negotiation with power. You didn't own your life, you borrowed it. From kings, from landlords, from the weather, and sometimes, from God's representatives, especially when your body failed you. When sickness came, or your roof collapsed, or war burned down your village, one place often stood as a final refuge, the monastery. But behind the stone walls, behind the chants and candles, the monks were not always what they seemed, because healing was rarely free, and neither was shelter. We tend to imagine monasteries as sanctuaries, calm, pious, generous, a place where poor souls found bread, safety, and comfort. And in part, that's true. Medieval monasteries were the closest thing many peasants had to hospitals, retirement homes, orphanages, or disaster relief. But help in that world came with a price. And sometimes, the price was your land. A peasant arrives at a monastery's gate, half-starved, coughing blood. Maybe his children are sick. Maybe his wife has died. Maybe his crops failed, and there's no one left to turn to. The monks bring him in. They pray. They offer herbs, warm food, a cot in the infirmary. Maybe he even survives. And then they ask, "Do you have land? A small plot, perhaps? Inherited. Poor soil, but his only inheritance." Maybe he resists. Maybe he hesitates. But the monks are persistent. They remind him he was saved, or sheltered, or healed. They suggest the land be given as a gift to God, in gratitude, or as penance, or to ensure his soul reaches heaven. It's hard to say no when you've already accepted the miracle. It's even harder when your only shelter is theirs. So, many peasants said yes. And over time, across Europe, the church's land grew, not through conquest, but through transactions like these, made under duress, disguised as charity. This wasn't fraud. It was legal. It was documented, often with witnesses. Gifts made freely, often after the recipient had received aid. But was it truly free? Or was it power, cloaked in mercy? By the 12th century, some monasteries had accumulated vast tracts of farmland, not because they bought it, but because desperate people gave it up after moments of weakness, grief, or fear. These weren't always small holdings. In some cases, sick nobles would grant entire estates in exchange for a monk's promise to pray for their soul. Death was terrifying in that age, and the church sold comfort, not always with coins, sometimes with land deeds. In some regions, these transactions became so common that peasant families would hide ailing relatives, afraid that if they sought church help, the family farm would vanish with them. Monasteries were feared as much as they were revered, not because they were cruel, but because their power was absolute, spiritual, legal, and economic, all in one. Imagine what that meant for the social structure. The monastery didn't pay taxes like a noble. It wasn't accountable like a lord, and yet it owned land, sometimes more than both. And unlike a secular ruler, it claimed its wealth in the name of eternal salvation. Who would dare question that? And here's the cruel twist. Once the land was given to the church, it almost never came back. It became sacred, locked in God's registry, passed from monk to monk, never back to the family who once lived there. Entire villages became church property, not through violence, but through slow attrition. Sickness, crisis, suffering, then mercy, then surrender. You might ask, did the monks know what they were doing? The answer is complicated. Some believed truly in the righteousness of the exchange. To offer land to the church was, to them, the highest form of gratitude, a pathway to spiritual redemption. Others were more pragmatic, aware that every acre increased their wealth, their security, their ability to influence local politics. And yes, some were opportunists, religious men but also businessmen, skilled negotiators cloaked in robes. In a world without modern medicine or social welfare, the monastery's role was essential, but essential doesn't mean innocent. It means powerful, and power never remains neutral. There were even legal systems within the church designed to formalize these gifts. Charters were written in Latin, with complex clauses. The illiterate peasant might leave a thumbprint, or be witnessed by a priest. The language would be soft, phrases like, "in return for divine aid," or "as thanks for shelter." But the result was the same. The monastery gained, the people lost, sometimes without realizing it. Now zoom out. Across England, France, Italy, Germany, you see a patchwork of rural lands slowly swallowed by ecclesiastical domains. By the late Middle Ages, the church owned an estimated 20 to 30% of all European land, not through conquest, not through taxation, but through sickness, through refuge, through the trade of healing for soil. This didn't go unnoticed. Peasant rebellions often included complaints about monastic land ownership, whispered stories of families who lost everything, of holy men who became landlords, of sanctuary that left people dispossessed. And in time, the backlash came. The Protestant Reformation didn't happen in a vacuum. It was fueled in part by resentment toward church wealth and where it came from. Reformers accused monasteries of exploiting the poor, of hiding behind charity while enriching themselves, of turning mercy into transaction. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries was as much about seizing land as it was about religious change, because everyone knew the monks held more than just prayers. They held property, land bought not with gold, but with illness, with desperation, with death. And the echoes of that still linger. We like to romanticize the past. Imagine the village monk as a kindly healer, asking for nothing but prayer. But real history is messier, and sometimes the robe conceals more than faith. Sometimes the sanctuary collects rent. Lords could turn a favor into military service. In the medieval world, favors were never free, especially not when they came from a lord. A noble might ride in with his armed men, chase off the raiders burning your crops, drive away the bandits threatening your family, and leave you with your farm intact, your village safe. You thank him, you swear your loyalty, and you mean it. But what you may not realize is that your life, your land, your very body, now belongs to him in a way that goes far beyond gratitude, because that single act of mercy is the beginning of a debt. And in the medieval code of obligation, a debt doesn't just hang over your head. It owns you. Years might pass. The Lord fades into the distance. You farm, you raise your children, you survive. But one day, a rider arrives at your door. Your Lord is at war. He remembers what he did for you. And now, he's calling in the favor. You are no longer a farmer. You are a soldier, a weapon. Whether you're trained or not, whether you believe in his cause or not, whether the war touches your life or not, you go. Or you face the consequences. Because refusing a noble's call wasn't just dishonor, it was treason. In feudal Europe, this system wasn't just common, it was the system. This was the heart of feudalism, a vast hierarchical web of favors owed and services demanded. Protection was given, but never freely. In exchange, the commoner owed the lord service. And when that lord raised his banner, every favor became a weapon of conscription. This wasn't about patriotism. There were no nations, no flags as we know them, only land and the men who controlled it. Lords kept their own armies, built not through loyalty alone, but through favors that had quietly morphed into lifelong contracts. And the cost? Often it was blood. A peasant who once sheltered under a noble's roof might die years later on a muddy battlefield far from home, killed in a feud he never started, under a crest he barely recognized. It wasn't just landowners. This practice stretched across Europe and beyond. In 12th century France, a knight might extend protection to a village from Viking or Moorish raids, only to return years later demanding men for his campaign against a rival noble. To refuse wasn't seen as self-preservation. It was betrayal. In England, the assize of arms in the 12th century codified this further. If a lord gave you protection, you were expected to own weapons in return, and to use them when summoned. Even if your hands had only ever held a plow, they would now hold a spear. But this wasn't just law, it was psychology. Because when someone saves your life, you're not just grateful, you're bound. You remember the smell of fire as raiders approached. You remember your child crying, your fields in flames, and you remember him, riding in with armored men, pushing the chaos back. How do you say no to that memory? How do you deny the man who once restored your world? Lords knew this. They counted on it. Their power was not just in swords or soldiers. It was in the slow buildup of obligation. Every act of aid was a seed, and years later, those seeds would become armies. In parts of medieval Italy, it was even worse. A noble might lend you silver to rebuild your barn after a storm, or protect your daughter from a corrupt tax collector. But hidden in that kindness was a silent clause. When the family calls, you answer. You march, or you vanish. In Japan, the samurai operated under a similar code. A daimyo who gave a gift, a horse, armor, or land, could demand your life in return. Not just service, not just work, your life. A favor was never simple. It was leverage. It was political currency, disguised as protection. Even in religious contexts, crusaders offered protection to entire villages on their way to the Holy Land. In return, supplies, soldiers, loyalty. Those who refused often found themselves accused of heresy, or simply left to die. What made this system so devastating was how quiet it was. There were no written contracts, no courtroom, just memory. and reputation. If a lord was known to collect his favors ruthlessly, people obeyed him without question. If you were seen refusing a call to arms, you weren't just abandoning a debt, you were undermining the entire system. And so it grew. A web of promises and threats, a network of invisible chains linking man to man, family to family, war to war. And for many, there was no escape. A favor given in your youth could come back decades later, just when you thought you were safe, just when you thought the past had let you go. But it hadn't. Because in the medieval world, there was no such thing as a free favor, and when the banners rose, you were expected to rise with them. A favor meant you owed loyalty, not just a task. In the medieval world, a favor was never just a gesture. It was a claim, a tether, a quiet contract that slipped into your blood, your duty, your future. You didn't just owe a task, you owed loyalty, total, binding, and unshakable. Even if the person who granted that favor later betrayed your village, your lord, your king. This was the unspoken code of feudal life. A favor binds not just your hands, but your heart. Imagine a knight rides through your village. Famine has come early. The crops have rotted. Your child is sick. The knight offers medicine, or food, or perhaps a single gesture of protection during a raid. No parchment is signed, no deal is spoken aloud, but the debt is real, and it does not expire. Because in the world of lords and loyalty, the gift isn't separate from the giver. If you accept his help, you accept him. His wars, his enemies, his politics, his ambitions. So when the day comes that this same knight turns against your liege, when he marches with rebels or plots with rivals, you are not free to walk away. The favor still stands, and so must your loyalty, even if it tears your village in half, even if it means fighting against the very king your father swore allegiance to, even if it feels like betrayal. To break that loyalty, that was unthinkable, dishonorable, dangerous, because to betray a favor was to sever the deepest thread of the feudal fabric. It wasn't about liking the person, it wasn't about right or wrong, it was about debt, and that debt was sacred. Across medieval Europe, this unwritten rule shaped alliances, fractured communities, and decided the fate of entire regions. A nobleman might give a poor farmer a plot of land during a harsh winter. Years later, that same farmer might be expected to take up arms against his own village lord, because the noble who helped him had declared a private feud. It didn't matter that the farmer disagreed. It didn't matter that his family would suffer. A favor had been given. Loyalty was owed. This wasn't just manipulation. It was culture. It was law. The entire feudal hierarchy was built not only on contracts and military might, but on personal obligation. The church even reinforced it. Clerics preached about the moral duty of honoring favors. To receive help and not repay it with loyalty was a spiritual failure, a sin against the natural order. And so, generations were trapped in a cycle of allegiance that reached far beyond any one task. In 12th century England, during the civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda, many peasants were caught in the middle. Some lords shifted sides, others rebelled. But the common folk? They followed whoever had once done them a kindness, not because they believed in the cause, but because they owed something. Even in the Mongol Empire, generals often demanded fealty in return for mercy. Entire clans survived only because they had once been spared. Years later, they marched in brutal campaigns, not out of agreement, but out of obligation. In Japan, samurai loyalty operated on this very premise. A gift from a daimyo could create a bond stronger than any legal oath. A servant or vassal would defend that master, even if it meant committing acts that dishonored their own family. The bond of favor trumped almost everything. And when nobles wanted to manipulate, they didn't need gold. They needed timing. Offer a gift during a crisis, when a man has no options, and he becomes yours. Not just his service, his allegiance. Some even engineered these moments. Deny help until the desperation deepens. Then arrive with your favor like a savior. The loyalty that followed would be unshakable, and if you refused to repay, you weren't just rude, you were treacherous. Dishonoring a favor could get you exiled, imprisoned, even executed. In one recorded case from 14th century France, a farmer who refused to support a noble's campaign, claiming loyalty to a different lord, was seized, publicly shamed, and had his land confiscated. The noble had once protected the farmer's fields from a roaming band of raiders. That single act, years ago, was used as proof. He belonged to the noble now. The crown tried to intervene, but even the king's messengers acknowledged that the debt of favor carried a kind of moral weight that laws couldn't easily override, because in the medieval mind, a man who could not be loyal to the hand that fed him could not be trusted by anyone. And so, the system endured. Even kindness became a collar. Even generosity had sharp edges. A favor could look like mercy, but feel like chains. It blurred the lines between friend and master, between rescuer and ruler, and the most haunting part? You might never see it coming. One winter's gift, one saved life, one ride to safety, and years later, a call to action, a debt collected, not for labor, but for loyalty. Total, unquestioned, forever. Breaking a favor oath could get you excommunicated. You made a vow, not a promise, not a casual agreement, a vow before God and before the church, and that meant something. In the medieval world, there was no separation between personal honor and divine law. If you swore to return a favor, to protect a friend, to avenge an ally, or simply to repay a kindness, you didn't just swear on your name, you swore on your soul. And if you broke that oath, you weren't just called dishonorable. You could be excommunicated. To the modern mind, excommunication sounds symbolic. But in the medieval world, it was more terrifying than death. It meant you were cut off, not just from the church, but from God himself. You could not receive sacraments, you could not confess, you could not marry in the eyes of the church, you could not be buried on sacred ground. You were spiritually dead, cast out of the living world and the afterlife, all for breaking a vow. But not just any vow, a favor oath, a pledge to repay someone who helped you, especially when that promise was sealed in a chapel or at a holy altar. This wasn't rare. Knights, nobles, and even commoners often swore such oaths. A man shelters you in wartime, you swear to protect his family. A woman hides you from soldiers, you swear to repay her. A rival spares your life in combat, you swear an oath before the cross to never harm him, or to one day return the grace. And if you broke that, the church considered it a spiritual betrayal, because when you make an oath in God's name, God becomes your witness. And if you break it, you're not just betraying a man, you're defying heaven. In the 12th century, the Council of Lateran reaffirmed that perjury, false oaths, broken vows was a mortal sin. Not just a legal issue, a damnation issue. And if that vow was tied to another person's well-being, the punishment was more severe, because you had endangered a soul through false witness. You didn't need to murder to be condemned. You just needed to swear and betray. In France, there are documented cases of peasants being denied burial because they failed to fulfill a sworn favor to their local lord. In Germany, a merchant who broke a debt oath was barred from entering churches across the Holy Roman Empire. In England, a knight who refused to rescue a man he swore to protect was not only stripped of lands, he was denied last rites. And that meant something worse than execution. It meant eternal unrest. To die without the sacraments was unthinkable. Your soul would wander, you would be cursed. Your name would be spoken in shame, and your body might rot outside the walls of the village. No prayer, no marker, no peace. But the fear wasn't only spiritual. Breaking a favor oath meant you became untouchable. Nobody wanted to deal with someone who had betrayed a sacred vow. You were marked as unsafe, unclean. If you broke a favor to one man, who's to say you wouldn't break it again? So word spread, and once it did, your life crumbled. No one would defend you in court. No one would marry into your family. No one would baptize your children. Your business would dry up. Your alliances would disappear. Even your enemies would pity you. You had broken the bond that held society together, because in the medieval world, favor was currency. It was how knights earned loyalty, how families survived, how entire villages defended themselves. The church didn't just preach morality, it enforced social fabric. And favor, once pledged under God, was part of that holy weave. Betray it, and you weren't just a sinner, you were an infection. And so, excommunication, not to punish, but to isolate, to protect the flock from someone whose word could no longer be trusted. The ceremony was chilling. The priest would stand before the altar and name you. Candles would be snuffed, one by one, to represent the light leaving your soul. Bells might ring, as for a funeral, and then the words would fall. Anathema, sit. Let him be cursed. You were outside the law of God, and until you repented and fulfilled your favor, you would remain there. Even kings were not exempt. In 1170, when Henry II's knights murdered Archbishop Thomas Becket, despite Henry's oath to protect him, the church placed England under interdict. No mass, no sacraments, no burials, an entire kingdom spiritually frozen, because of a broken favor. This is how seriously it was taken. The act of swearing to repay someone, especially with the church as witness, wasn't just a personal contract. It was a vow written in heaven's ink, and to fail it was to tear a hole in the moral universe. In a world where justice was rare, where courts were corrupt and armies ruled, favor oaths were sacred. They were promises strong enough to survive war, exile, and time, but only if they were honored. So when a man broke that vow, it wasn't just a disappointment. It was a spiritual scandal, a shattering. And to this day, somewhere in the cold records of forgotten monasteries, there are names listed without burial, without blessing, without light, because they made a vow and failed to return the favor. You might be forced to hide a fugitive or commit a crime. In the medieval world, survival was currency, but so was loyalty. And once someone saved you, helped you, or gave you protection, the debt wasn't forgotten. It was planted, buried in your life. And sometimes, that debt would grow into something dark, something dangerous. You might be forced to lie to the sheriff, to hide a fugitive, to shelter a murderer. Not out of evil, but because you owed someone a favor. And in a world where alliances mattered more than laws, refusing that favor wasn't just impolite. It could get you killed. This is the forgotten code of medieval obligation, a brutal reality where helping someone once meant owning a piece of their soul. And when the favor was called in, you didn't get to ask why, you just obeyed. Imagine this. You're a poor farmer. 5 winters ago, your child was dying. A rider came through your village, a stranger. He gave you medicine, or food, or coin. Maybe he asked for nothing in return. Maybe he just vanished into the night. But now he's back. Blood on his shirt. A knife at his side. He knocks on your door in the middle of the night and he says, "You owe me." What do? If you turn him away, he could be killed. Or worse. He could speak. He could tell others what you did, what you know, what you owe. And if word gets out that you refused a favor, your name becomes worthless. Your reputation, ruined. No one helps those who don't pay their debts, so you let him in. You feed him, hide him, lie for him. Maybe you dig a hole under the floorboards. Maybe you tell the sheriff you've seen nothing. Maybe you watch the blood on his boots dry and say nothing. You don't even ask who he killed, because that's not the point. The favor is the point. Medieval law was supposed to be clear. Crimes had punishments. Guilt had consequences. But the law didn't live in the courtroom. It lived in the village, in whispers, in debts, in secrets passed from one mouth to another. And in many cases, honor, not justice, decided your fate. Sometimes the crime wasn't murder, sometimes it was theft. A man gives you a gift, a tool, a horse, a blanket in a storm. Years later, he shows up again. This time, he needs you to hide something. A bag of stolen goods, a weapon, a symbol. You know it's illegal. You know it could mean lashes, or jail, or hanging. But you take it anyway, because there's no such thing as a free favor. And these debts weren't just personal. Families owed families. Clans owed clans. One brother's loyalty could trap an entire bloodline into decades of silence. If a lord once saved your father's life, his son might demand your loyalty 50 years later. And refusal? That was betrayal. It didn't matter what he asked, even if it meant lying to the king's guard, even if it meant breaking the law with your own hands, even if it meant hiding someone who killed your neighbor, because the code wasn't written on paper. It was written in fear, and fear ruled everything. These were not isolated events. Across medieval Europe, the system of compacts, pacts, and informal obligations was stronger than royal law. In many villages, the local sheriff didn't have real power. He was feared, yes, but not more than the social structure holding the village together. And if the village had decided to protect one of their own, even a killer, the sheriff could be lied to by every mouth, turned away from every door, made a fool in his own jurisdiction. Because the truth was, everyone was protecting someone. And the reasons didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about balance. One hand washed another, one favor repaid another. And sometimes crimes were committed in the name of keeping that fragile peace intact. Think of the blacksmith who forged an illegal blade because he owed a knight his life. The widow who let a thief sleep in her hayloft because he once saved her son from drowning. The baker who passed secret letters for a rebel faction because years ago one of them brought flour when the whole village was starving. These stories are rarely told because they blur the line between villain and victim. They show a world where kindness becomes leverage, where a moment of mercy plants a seed that can grow into coercion, where helping someone can haunt you for the rest of your life, not because you regret it, but because one day the cost comes due, and when it does, you don't get to choose your morality. You don't get to say, I don't believe in this. You just remember the moment they helped you, and you pay, even if it breaks you, even if it destroys someone else, even if the only way out is silence. This was life in the age before police forces, before formal contracts, before rights. The law wasn't carved in stone. It was negotiated daily in barns and alleys and back rooms. And justice didn't always come from the righteous. Sometimes it came from the one who owed the most and had no choice but to commit the next crime. Because when favors are binding, loyalty becomes dangerous, and mercy can become a weapon. Servants could be forced into lifelong labor over a meal. In the medieval world, survival was a debt, and sometimes all it took was a single meal, a starving man, a desperate woman, a child trembling from hunger. When they stood before a noble's gate, it wasn't just food they were begging for. It was permission to live. And when the lord, the lady, or the steward extended a crust of bread, a bowl of stew, or a place by the hearth, something far more binding than gratitude was exchanged. Because mercy came with a price. You ate, and now you owed. In many regions across feudal Europe, a noble's act of feeding a starving commoner was not considered charity. It was a transaction, one you may never have agreed to consciously, but one society, law, and culture had already written for you. A servant who received food during a harsh winter might find themselves in that noble's service for years or decades, and refusing? That wasn't an option. It would be seen as betrayal, dishonor, even criminality, because you accepted a gift. And in this world, gifts were binding. In some cases, there didn't even need to be a formal contract. No ink, no witnesses, just a bowl of food and a silent understanding. From this day on, you belong to the house that saved you. In medieval England, the system of villeinage blurred the lines between servitude and survival. A man might seek shelter on a noble's estate during famine and find himself absorbed into the manor's labor force for life, his children born into servitude, his name tied to the land, all for a piece of bread. But it wasn't just England. In parts of France, Italy, and the Germanic kingdoms, unwritten laws governed how favors were repaid. When a noble rescued you, you were marked, not physically, but socially. You were now theirs, not in chains, but in obligation. And in some cases, even kindness became a trap. A noble woman might take in a poor girl, feed her, clothe her, teach her how to work in the kitchen or manage the laundry. But that education was not freedom, it was grooming. By the time the girl was 15, she knew nothing else. She had no coin, no family, and no right to leave. Because the meal that saved her had become the chain that held her. Lords would use this system to maintain endless labor supplies. Feed a hungry peasant in the winter, demand 30 years of work in the fields, house a boy whose parents died of plague, force him to serve your sons until his own hands withered. And the law? It favored the noble. In many feudal courts, testimony about such debts didn't require written proof. The noble's word was enough. If they said you owed them for their kindness, the court often agreed. Because the system was never about fairness, it was about power, and power loved invisible contracts. In Eastern Europe, variations of this practice crept into the serfdom structure. Entire villages would be fed after wars or famines, only to find themselves eternally bonded to the estate that saved them. The meal became generational. grandfathers, sons, and grandsons all repaying the same kindness. But even outside of Europe, the pattern repeated. In parts of Asia and the Middle East, hospitality was sacred, but it also created obligation. If a high-born figure saved you from death, your loyalty might be demanded for life. A servant in 15th century Persia might receive a nobleman's help and be expected to follow his house to the grave, even in exile. What began as mercy became a shadow that followed them forever. And often, these weren't cruel masters. Many believed they were generous, that their feeding of the poor was noble, holy. But what they never questioned was the cost. They fed you not to free you. They fed you to own you. And those who tried to escape were branded as ungrateful, dishonorable, criminals. Imagine this. You're 19. You were orphaned at 12. A lord gave you food and shelter when no one else would. But now you're strong, capable, dreaming of something more. And when you ask to leave, he reminds you, I saved your life. And just like that, the door closes, because in his eyes, and in the eyes of the world, the debt was not paid. It could never be paid. Because it wasn't about the meal. It was about control. Control dressed as compassion. A bowl of food in exchange for your life's freedom. This was the unspoken reality of medieval mercy. Beneath the rituals of hospitality, beneath the banners of generosity, was a darker truth. The hungry had no leverage, and those with power knew it. So, when they offered you bread, it wasn't an escape from hunger. It was an invitation into servitude. And once you took that bite, there was no going back. Midwives might claim a favor that cost you your reputation. Childbirth in the medieval world was a moment of terror. No doctors, no hospitals, just pain, blood, and risk. A wrong cut, a bad turn, a fever, and both mother and child could die. In those moments, one figure held the key between life and death, the midwife. She wasn't just a healer, she was witness, she was protector, and sometimes, she was the most dangerous person in the room. Because some midwives, after pulling a child into the world, would demand something far more enduring than coin. A favor, a debt, a binding thread. One that could later be pulled to unravel your status, your land, even your name. This is the dark side of medieval midwifery, where a sacred act of care became a lever for power. And if you refused to repay, she could destroy your reputation with a single sentence. In many villages, midwives knew everything. They had access to a family's most vulnerable moments, whispered affairs, illegitimate births, fears of stillborns, even the unspoken wishes to avoid another child. They saw bloodlines before they were official. They knew if a baby had the wrong hair, the wrong eyes, the wrong father. And when they helped in silence, it created a silence that could be broken. A woman might go into labor afraid her child was not her husband's. A midwife might deliver that child, nod silently, and walk away. No confrontation, no judgment, until years later when the midwife returned, asking for land access, a share of harvest, or even a voice in inheritance matters, not as blackmail, not as violence, but as the collection of a favor. Remember, she'd say, when I helped in your hour of need, and that favor was not a single act repaid. It became a lifelong grip. There are recorded cases from late medieval England and rural France where midwives were called before local lords, not for malpractice, but for influence. One midwife in Normandy in the early 15th century had attended the birth of a nobleman's illegitimate child. She kept the secret. Years later, she claimed the right to live on his land, tax-free. When questioned, she offered no threats. Only a single reminder. Had I spoken once, his wife would have taken the estate to ruin. The favor, unspoken, became a political tool. In other cases, midwives used their role to secure marriage opportunities for their kin. They'd remind families of the birth they safeguarded and ask that their niece be considered for a future union. To refuse risked scandal, because one word from the midwife could cast doubt over a child's legitimacy. And in a world where inheritance ruled everything, that single doubt could burn down an entire bloodline. The church often remains silent on this, because midwives also performed spiritual roles, whispering baptism rites if the child seemed close to death, comforting mothers with holy words. They stood at the edge between life and the afterlife. Few dared challenge them, but not all midwives exploited their role. Many were fiercely loyal, risking their own lives to help the helpless. But the ones who did wield power did so with precision. They understood leverage, because childbirth didn't just produce life, it produced vulnerability. A noble woman screaming in agony, terrified of dying in a pool of blood. A father waiting outside, praying for a son. A family whispering about whether the baby would survive, and if it should. And in the center of it all stood the midwife, calm, knowing, watching. And when it was over, she often held the truth and the story. And whoever controls the story controls the legacy. In Eastern European records, there are accounts of midwives being gifted land parcels by nobles, not out of gratitude, but out of fear. Fear that the midwife could testify to something shameful, a premature birth, a switched child, a stillborn replaced with another. Stories we now see as folklore may have roots in real manipulations. One Bavarian tale tells of a midwife who helped deliver a child born under a blood moon, deformed, silent, marked. The midwife swore secrecy, and in return was allowed to build her own cottage on the edge of the estate. No contract was signed, but none dared revoke her right. Even commoners were not safe from this web. A peasant family helped by a midwife might later be forced to lend labor, offer dowry, or host her aging relatives. If they refused, she might mention, casually in public, that the child born that night didn't cry right away, or that she had to use special herbs, or that she saw something strange. It didn't have to be true. In a superstitious age, the hint was enough. And so, people complied. Not out of law, not out of gratitude, but because the favor that helped them survive could also be the thing that unmade them. So the next time we romanticize the image of the medieval midwife as merely a gentle healer, remember this. She held more than life in her hands. She held secrets, and secrets are currency. In a world where bloodlines were sacred, land was power, and scandal was ruin, a single favor from the wrong midwife might cost you everything you were trying to protect. Criminals used favors to trap the innocent. There's a chilling truth buried in the shadows of history. Favors weren't always acts of kindness. Sometimes they were traps, laid like snares, offered by wolves dressed as friends. Because in a world where honor was currency and loyalty was law, criminals learned how to manipulate the system. They learned that if they gave just enough, they could take everything. It was a twisted form of generosity. A known thief might lend a tool to fix your roof. He might share his stolen bread with your hungry child. Or he might protect your wife during a raid. And in that moment, you'd feel grateful, relieved, indebted. But that gratitude came with a price, because in the eyes of your village, your town, your tribe, you now owed him. And the moment he came to collect, you were trapped. Not with chains or knives, but with a favor you never wanted. In medieval towns across Europe, where law enforcement was patchy and reputations traveled faster than horses, known criminals were often embedded in the community. They weren't strangers, they were neighbors. And many of them used their social proximity as a weapon. They'd wait for the perfect moment to offer help. When your house caught fire, when your child fell ill, when your crops were dying, their assistance would be swift, selfless, and unforgettable. But then came the knock. Quiet, cold, a whisper in the dark. I need you to lie to the sheriff, just once. Say you saw me at the well, that I wasn't near the merchant's cart, that I didn't take the money. And what could you say? No. After what they did for you? The moral trap was almost perfect. If you refused, you weren't just ungrateful. You were dishonorable, a betrayer. You turned your back on someone who once saved you, even if that person was a known criminal. Historical records from 14th century London mention several cases where townsfolk were interrogated after giving false testimony to protect local gang members. One woman, Agnes Fletcher, claimed she was pressured to swear a thief was at her home during the time of a robbery. Years earlier, that same thief had saved her child from drowning in the Thames. Her guilt was real, and her debt, she believed, even greater than the law. In Renaissance Florence, where politics and criminal syndicates were deeply entwined, local mafias operated under the guise of patronage. They'd fund small churches, pay for widows' rent, give grain to the poor, and in return, they owned you, not legally, but spiritually. So when they demanded silence or forged testimony or that you look the other way as someone was taken, you obeyed. Because they had given when others hadn't. Because to betray them meant to betray mercy itself. This was the true genius of favor-based control. It turned the innocent into accomplices. In Ottoman territories, accounts describe similar methods used by highwaymen and warlords. A traveling merchant might be spared on the road by a bandit, told to go home, safe and untouched. Weeks later, that same bandit would arrive at the merchant's home and ask for a horse, or a hiding place, or a false oath before a judge, and the merchant, remembering his spared life, would comply. Because to refuse wasn't just dangerous, it was shameful. Even samurai culture in feudal Japan had its version of this trap. Rogue ronin, masterless samurai, might help defend a town from bandits or settle a dispute with swordplay, but they did so knowing that once they'd given aid, they'd earned leverage. They'd later ask the village elder to provide a falsified record or cover their trail after a duel, and if the elder refused, it reflected badly on the entire town's honor, because to deny a benefactor, even a dangerous one, was to dishonor yourself. And sometimes, the criminal didn't even need to ask for much, just your silence, just your inaction, just a simple, deadly hesitation when someone asked you, "Do you know where he went?" This manipulation of honor systems was not accidental. It was strategy, psychological warfare, and it worked because communities valued loyalty more than justice. Justice was the sheriff's job. Loyalty, that was personal. In African oral traditions, there are fables of hyenas who help antelopes out of mud pits, only to later demand they act as lookouts during hunts. The moral wasn't about trickery. It was about the danger of accepting help from those whose lives move in darkness, because once you did, the favor owned you. There are chilling stories from 19th century Russia where peasant women, saved from starvation by black market traders, were later forced to house fugitives. Some were caught and executed. Their only crime? Failing to repay a kindness by saying no. This dynamic continued into the early 20th century. In immigrant neighborhoods in New York, the Italian mafia would offer protection to new arrivals, help them find jobs, pay for funerals. But these weren't free gifts, they were investments. The recipients were expected to return the favor, sometimes by laundering money, sometimes by staying quiet, sometimes by taking the fall. One man, a barber, testified years later that he had been forced to let a fugitive hide in his basement for a week. Why? Because 20 years earlier, that same man had given his family a loan when no one else would. "I didn't see a criminal," he said. "I saw the man who kept my children alive." That's how deep the manipulation ran. The favor became a part of your identity, a wound you carried with gratitude, even if it killed you. This tactic didn't require violence. It relied on something stronger, the fear of being seen as ungrateful, of betraying a debt that once saved your life. And in many cultures, being called ungrateful was worse than being called a liar. It was a silent war between honor and truth. So, what does this mean for us today? That favors are dangerous? That kindness is always a trap? No. But history whispers a warning. Not all hands that help you want you free. Because in the shadows of history, a criminal didn't always need to steal your money. Sometimes, all they needed was your gratitude. And once they had that, they had you. Favors could be twisted into marriage proposals you couldn't refuse. Your family accepted a favor, a loan when they were desperate, a shipment of food in a winter that threatened to kill, protection from bandits, a kind word to the right official that saved your father from prison. They took the favor gratefully, respectfully, but you were the real price. Because months or years later, a letter would arrive, or a messenger on horseback, and they'd say the words that turned your blood cold. It's time to repay the debt. Not with money, with marriage. It didn't matter what you wanted, whether the man was old, diseased, abusive, or cruel, whether the match made your skin crawl or your future vanish. The favor had been accepted, and now the debt was being called in. You weren't a person in that moment. You were the repayment. In medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, and even Qing Dynasty China, favors weren't simple acts of goodwill. They were seeds, quietly planted, waiting for the day when they could be harvested as leverage. And one of the most powerful forms of repayment was marriage. Because to bind a family to your bloodline was to gain permanent status, control, power, an inescapable claim. And for families who owed a debt, refusing the match wasn't just ungrateful, it was dangerous. In feudal societies, refusing to honor a marriage request from someone who had once helped you was seen as a direct insult, a betrayal. You were breaking not just a social code, but a sacred covenant, and powerful people don't like to be refused. Sometimes, it wasn't even the person who received the favor who was married off. It was their child. You could be 10 years old when your mother accepted help from a merchant. And by the time you were 16, that merchant would arrive at your doorstep, demanding your hand for his son. It was all very polite on the surface, formal, respectful. But behind the words was a blade, because if your family refused, the favor could be reinterpreted as a contract. And if a contract was broken, there would be consequences. The merchant might call in debts, withdraw protection, send thugs, spread rumors, or worse, appeal to the local lord or church to intervene, claiming you were dishonoring an agreement made in good faith. And often, that was enough. Because in a world without legal protections, social obligation ruled everything. A broken word was a broken life, and the ones with power wrote the narrative. In 15th century Florence, documented cases show noble families demanding their daughters be wed to the sons of merchants who had financed them during lean years. One girl, barely 15, was forced to marry a man twice her age after her father accepted grain during a famine. She protested. She begged. But the priest arrived. The contract was read, and she was taken. In many parts of Europe, a marriage promise, spoken even casually, could become binding. If a favor had been accepted, it was assumed that gratitude came with a price, and sometimes that price was your body. Imagine this. Your brother falls ill. A wealthy landowner pays for his medicine. Your family praises him, calls him a godsend. 2 years later, he visits your home. He looks at you, not with love, but with ownership. Your family owes me, he says. I want her. You've never met him before. You've heard the rumors, that he drinks, that he beats women, that he's been sick for months. But your father's hands are tied, because how do you refuse the man who saved your son? In rural Ireland, even as late as the 18th century, cases were recorded of women being married off under the phrase, in honor of the house. That meant someone had done a service for the family, and the daughter's hand was now the only respectable currency left to offer. And if you fled, the shame followed you. The community whispered, your family was disgraced. The man who had once helped you became your hunter, because you weren't just denying him love. You were denying him a debt he believed he owned. Favors were sticky things. They looked like kindness, but they could turn into shackles, because the social contract was not made of parchment. It was made of expectations. And when those expectations weren't met, the punishment could be ruin. For many young women throughout history, that punishment was lifelong. Married to men they despised, forced to bear children for families that only saw them as trophies, locked into homes that were bought, not with love, but with past generosity. There were no laws to protect them, no escape clause, because once the favor was taken, the obligation lived in your blood. And so, you walked down an aisle not meant for you. Not because you loved, but because someone helped your family when they were weak, and now you belong to them. Villagers were forced into risky tasks, like climbing towers or fixing roofs. In the medieval village, survival didn't come from strength. It came from who you owed, and when someone helped you, fed your child, patched your roof, stood by you when no one else did, that favor became a quiet debt, one not recorded on parchment, but carved into your daily life. And when they came to collect, you didn't get to say no, even if it meant climbing the crumbling bell tower in a storm, even if it meant repairing the thatch roof of a stranger's inn, even if it meant risking your life for something that wasn't yours. Because in that world, obligation was sacred, and sometimes deadly. Imagine this. A man once gave your family food during a famine. You've never forgotten. He never asked for anything, until now. Years later, he needs help fixing the spire on the local chapel. The scaffolding is weak, the ladders wobble in the wind, and there's no safety rope. But you're young, agile. Climb it, he says, just for a few hours. You're terrified. But you go because you owe him. And in that world, to say no wasn't just rude, it was betrayal. It shattered the unwritten law of loyalty that held the village together. You weren't just risking your reputation. You were risking exile, isolation, and in a world without medicine, warmth, or allies, that was a slow death sentence. So you climbed. And if you fell, Well, that was the cost of honor. These tasks were everywhere: fixing a damaged roof during a windstorm, carrying heavy stones across a frozen stream, repairing a broken fence near a wolf den, helping an injured ox across a collapsed bridge. They weren't noble, they weren't glorious, but they were dangerous and expected. Because favors weren't just called in for small things. They were called in when no one else would do it. When a man needed someone to risk their neck, he called on someone who owed him. And in most cases, they came. Because no one wanted to be the one who broke the chain. And these tasks weren't for trained craftsmen. They were for whoever was available, whoever was desperate, whoever had a debt on their soul that had aged just long enough to come due. The man who helped dig your father's grave years ago might now ask you to help raise a beam on the town hall. He'll say, "You remember, don't you?" And you do. You remember the cold, the silence, the gratitude, and now you have no choice. The beam is high, the support is cracked, but you go. Because debt in a village wasn't just between two people, it was public. Everyone knew, everyone watched, and everyone waited to see if you'd keep your end of the silent contract. Sometimes people died doing these favors. Sometimes they fell from towers, drowned in rivers, were crushed by wagons, or kicked by animals. And sometimes they were buried with nothing more than a whisper. He died doing his part. That was the best they could hope for. Honor in death. A memory of loyalty. And if you survived, you just kept going. Until the next favor was called in. This system wasn't written down, it wasn't enforced by any king, but it was real as rain, as real as the way people looked at you when you said, "I can't," because in truth you could. You just didn't want to, and that was worse than failure. It was shame, and shame was a stain that didn't wash out. That's why children were taught early. When someone helps you, you help them back, not just in kind, but in full, even if it costs you. Even if it hurts, because that was how the village stayed alive, through mutual pain, through shared risk, through a chain of sacrifice that bound every roof, every tool, every hand. This wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it saved lives. Sometimes it built trust. But it also demanded obedience, and it didn't care about fairness. You could be poor, sick, tired, or afraid. It didn't matter. If the favor was called, you answered. Because if you didn't, people would remember. And when you needed help, no one would come. That was the real fear. Not the fall, not the injury, but the silence that followed. So you climbed. You hammered. You carried. You bled. Because in a village held together by unspoken debts, the most dangerous thing wasn't the height of the tower. It was the weight of a promise, and the price of not keeping it. Church officials could demand religious obedience as payback. In the medieval world, salvation had a price, and it wasn't always paid with gold. Sometimes it was paid with obedience. The church held immense power, not just over the soul, but over the body, over land, labor, law, and legacy. And when a priest offered help, food, shelter, forgiveness, it wasn't always charity. It was leverage. You come to the chapel half-starved, begging for mercy. The priest gives you bread, a place to sleep, a promise of prayer. You thank him. You kneel. You whisper your gratitude to God. But you don't walk away free. Because in that moment, your life has changed. Not just spiritually, but contractually. You may now be required to work church land every week, without pay. You may be told to donate the best of your harvest to the altar, even if your own family goes hungry. You may be summoned to daily mass, required to confess, to obey, to attend religious festivals, and contribute time, goods, or livestock under the threat of eternal consequences. And if you resist, you risk more than disapproval. You risk damnation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system. Across medieval Europe, church officials acted not only as spiritual guides, but as landlords, judges, and tax collectors. And they understood something critical. The fear of hell was stronger than any sword. If a noble demanded your labor, you might try to flee. But if the church said God demanded it, you stayed. Because defiance wasn't just rebellion, it was sin. A priest could frame obligation as salvation. He could say, "Work the fields of the Lord, and your soul will be washed clean. Refuse." And he could say, "You spit on the mercy God gave you." In many regions, especially during the High Middle Ages, the church owned more land than the crown. Monasteries ran farms, cathedrals collected tithes, and the peasants who lived near them often depended on clerical favor to survive. But help was never free. If you begged for food from a bishop's granary during a bad harvest, it was common to be bound to repay that favor with labor, working the monastery's wheat fields, tending its livestock, or cutting wood for the clergy. Sometimes, that obligation lasted for a season. Sometimes, for the rest of your life. In some cases, even your family was drawn in. If your parents received church protection during a war, the children might be expected to serve as altar boys or cloister assistants. And refusal? It wasn't seen as disobedience, it was spiritual defection. Because once you were touched by the mercy of the church, you were expected to serve it, with your time, your goods, your body, and always, your soul. In 13th century France, a man who was healed by a traveling monk reported being harassed by his local abbey for the rest of his life. He had received a miracle, they said, and that miracle had to be repaid. He was required to give the church his oxen. When he refused, he was excommunicated. And in the eyes of the village, that meant worse than death. It meant isolation. It meant your neighbors turned away. It meant your burial would not be honored. Because once the church declared you outside of grace, you became a ghost among the living. This power was deeply psychological. The priest didn't have to beat you. He just had to imply the eternal consequences of ingratitude. God gave you help. Why are you so quick to forget? It didn't take much. A whispered warning. A cold look during Mass. The subtle threat that your soul might be weighed differently if you didn't give something back. And sometimes, the obligation was disguised as opportunity. The priest might ask you to donate a lamb to the church. Not demand, but ask. Refusal would not be punished by law, but by shame, by gossip, by the whispered question of whether you were truly faithful. Because in a world built on superstition and salvation, shame was enough. You would give the lamb. You would give your time. You would give your children. And if you hesitated, even for a moment, you could be accused of heresy, or worse, of being ungrateful to God. That was the trap. The church gave freely, but only on the surface. Beneath the blessing was a hook, and once it was in you, it never really let go. Because even if you moved to another town, another region, another life, the church was there, watching, waiting, ready to remind you that the mercy you received was not a gift, it was a debt, and it would follow you to the grave. Nobles used favors to build armies of unpaid loyalty. In medieval society, war didn't begin with swords. It began with favors. Before banners were raised, before messengers were sent galloping across the countryside, before the drums of conflict echoed across the fields, lords already knew who would fight for them, because they'd spent years building something far more powerful than an army, a network of unpaid loyalty, forged not by wages, but by favors. This is how power truly worked in the feudal world. A noble didn't need to hire soldiers, he needed to be owed. And so, quietly, methodically, patiently, he gave. He lent a plow when yours broke. He forgave a tax when your harvest failed. He sent protection during a bandit raid. He gave your son permission to marry, your daughter permission to serve. Each act seemed generous, merciful, almost noble. But behind every gesture was a hook. Because favors weren't gifts, they were investments. And one day, the Lord would come to collect. Not in coin, but in loyalty. You, your family, your neighbors, when summoned, you could not refuse. You were part of his invisible army. No uniform. No pay, no oath, but loyalty, deeply felt, because he helped you when no one else would. And in that world, help was rare. The crown was distant, the church was slow, but your local lord, he had power, and he knew how to spend it. Favors became currency, not just to control individuals, but entire villages. A blacksmith allowed to keep more of his profits might forge armor when the time came. A miller granted extra grain rights would spread loyalty among nearby farmers. A healer permitted to work without interference would care for the Lord's wounded, without charge. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were strategic moves. Every favor a stitch, every stitch a thread in a cloak of control. And when war came, whether against rival lords, rebellious vassals, or even the king himself, The noble did not need to beg for troops. He simply reminded people of what he had done. And they came. Not because they believed in his cause, not because they wanted to fight, but because they owed him. Because 10 years ago, when your daughter was dying of fever and no one else would ride to find herbs, his steward did. Because 5 winters ago, when your fields froze over and you had no bread, his kitchen sent a cart. Because when the church refused to bury your father, he overruled them. And now you march, unpaid, unarmed, afraid, but loyal. Because favors in that time weren't forgotten. They were recorded, not on paper, but in memory, in gossip, in pride. Your identity, your standing in the village, was tied to whether you were loyal to the man who fed you in your time of need. To defy him now was to erase that debt, to spit on the hand that once lifted you from hunger. In some regions, nobles were so skilled at this system that they never had to raise a formal army. They simply asked, and people came. And if someone didn't, the pressure didn't come from guards. It came from neighbors, from kin, from the village elder who whispered, "Have you forgotten who helped you when your roof collapsed?" The coercion wasn't violent. It was cultural. It was emotional. And often, it worked better than force. Records from late medieval France describe peasants marching under banners they didn't even recognize because they felt they owed their local lord a debt, not a financial one, a moral one. And what's more chilling? These networks of unpaid loyalty could span generations. A favor granted to your grandfather could still bind you. Family stories became chains. You remember what he did for us? We don't turn our back on him. And so the army grew, not through the coin or conquest, but through quiet, relentless obligation. In England, during the War of the Roses, many minor nobles had no standing army, and yet they fielded hundreds of men. How? Because they had been carefully, deliberately kind when it mattered most. They fed the hungry. They forgave debts. They married off daughters. They offered mercy, just once, so that when they finally needed support, the answer wasn't, "Why should I help you?" It was, "How could I not?" And this perhaps is the most haunting lesson. In the medieval world, the most dangerous nobles weren't the cruel ones. They were the generous ones, because generosity could not be refused, and once accepted, it echoed forever. So when you picture a medieval army, don't just imagine steel and banners. Imagine favors, old kindnesses, quiet debts, and entire communities marching not for gold, but for a name they couldn't bear to betray. Peasants were forced to spy or lie for landowners. In medieval and early modern Europe, peasants weren't just workers, they were pawns, and sometimes spies. Not by choice, not by loyalty, but by debt. Because when a peasant owed a favor to a powerful landowner, repayment didn't come in silver, or sheep, or sweat. Sometimes it came in secrets, it came in lies, it came in betrayal. Across feudal societies, a single act of kindness from a noble, a plot of land to till, a few bushels of grain during a harsh winter, the delay of a debt payment, was rarely just charity. It was leverage. And when the time came, that leverage was cashed in. Not for gold, but for obedience. Obedience that turned neighbor against neighbor. In the dusty archives of 14th century France, there are records of peasants being asked, no, expected, to report on who was hiding grain from tax collectors, who was meeting after hours in the forest, who was whispering about rebellion, and those who had once received mercy from a lord, a lighter tithe, protection from conscription, or food during famine, found themselves unable to say no, because a favor in those days was a silent contract. And when a lord asked for a lie, you didn't ask questions, you gave it. In England under the Plantagenets, the manor system governed the lives of most rural people. Lords and stewards had total control over land, housing, and even justice. A peasant who received a second cow after theirs died might be approached a year later with a quiet request. Tell me if your neighbor plans to move to another estate. If you refused, you risked losing everything, not just your favor, but your livelihood. And the betrayal wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. Some landowners demanded that peasants lie to church officials during audits, to hide how much grain had been harvested, to underreport livestock, to swear that certain illegal dealings never happened. And if you hesitated, you weren't just disobedient, you were faithless. In some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, peasants were ordered to swear oaths to protect their lord's secrets. These weren't criminals, they were farmers. But by accepting land or tools in hard times, they were drawn into a game of silence. They became agents of concealment. Even the church, with its hunger for tithes, couldn't fully pierce the wall of collusion built on favors. There's a particularly grim account from 15th century Bavaria, where a peasant was given timber to rebuild his home after a fire. Months later, the baron's men came to him and said, "Your neighbor is hoarding rye. Tell the tax agents you saw nothing." He refused. Days later, he was found dead in a river. His house burned again. This time, no timber came. In Poland, similar stories emerged under the folwark system. Lords offered seasonal forgiveness of rent to peasants who would inform them of potential disobedience in the village. Those who complied, lived. Those who didn't. But the manipulation ran deeper than just fear. Landowners often made themselves seem like saviors. During droughts or plague, when nobles handed out bread or let families stay rent-free for a month, it looked like mercy. But that mercy came with strings, and those strings tied themselves around your soul. So when that same noble asked, "Who's been complaining about me to the bishop?" the answer was already bought. Some peasants were even tasked with fabricating evidence, accusing others of hiding tithe payments, claiming that a neighbor slandered the Lord, helping build false cases against men and women who had once shared bread, shared births, shared prayers, and perhaps the most disturbing part, sometimes the peasants did it willingly, not out of malice, but survival. Because in a world where land was everything, and your family's ability to eat depended on the mood of a man in a castle, betrayal became a form of currency, a way to buy one more year of peace. In Eastern Europe, especially under serfdom, lords used peasants as political tools. A favor today, a new plow, an extra bag of seed, could be traded for a false statement tomorrow. Tell the crown's inspector that I paid the taxes, and if you didn't, your field might be left to rot. Your sons might be sent to war. Even women weren't spared. In 17th century Russia, a serf woman whose child had been treated by the Lord's doctor was later forced to accuse her own cousin of theft. She broke down during the trial, but the damage was done. And over time, a strange kind of guilt emerged, one passed like a sickness from generation to generation. Peasants who had lied to survive taught their children to stay quiet, to nod when the steward spoke, to remember who once gave them that cow, that roof, that second chance. In many villages, the code was clear. Loyalty wasn't about truth. It was about memory, about what you owed. This practice left scars, emotional, generational, spiritual, and in some communities it destroyed the very fabric of trust. People no longer looked at each other as equals in toil. They saw potential spies, liars, debt-burdened traitors, forced to choose between justice and survival. And that's the dark legacy of favor under feudal power. Because when a landowner gave you something, he didn't just offer help. He claimed a part of you. And the debt didn't ask for coins. It asked for silence, for betrayal, for lies whispered in the name of gratitude. So, the next time you hear that someone did a peasant a favor, ask yourself, what did it cost? Because in the world of the past, even the smallest kindness could become a weapon. A favor given was a truth taken. Refusing to repay a favor could lead to public shaming. You didn't pay them back. Maybe you meant to. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you thought the favor was small, just a day's shelter during a storm, a handful of grain in a bad season, a word spoken in your defense at the wrong time. But in the eyes of your village, your town, your church, you committed a grave offense. Because in the old world, favors were not suggestions. They were contracts. Spoken or unspoken, they were binding, sacred, woven into the fabric of trust. And when you broke that trust, not with violence, but with ingratitude, the punishment was swift. And it was public. You might wake one morning to find a black mark drawn on your door, a smudge of charcoal, or a handprint made of ash. It meant you were unclean, not in body, but in soul. It told your neighbors, this one does not repay. Don't lend to him. Don't trade with him. Don't trust him. It was silent, but loud enough to echo across a village. And if the favor you denied was serious, say, a family you promised to help in return for saving your child, or a laborer you vowed to pay for fixing your roof, it wouldn't stop at a mark. You'd be taken to the center of town, strapped to a wooden board, locked into stocks. Not for stealing, not for murder, for disgrace, for debt of honor. And people would gather. They'd throw rotten fruit, mud, animal waste. Children would laugh. Elders would shake their heads. Strangers would spit at your feet. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't do. Because you refused to honor the unwritten law. A favor repaid is a soul preserved. A favor denied is a soul condemned. In medieval France, failure to repay a sacred favor, especially one sworn before witnesses, could result in formal charivari. It was called the rough music. People would gather outside your home at night, banging pots, shouting insults, imitating pigs, dogs, demons. They would chant your name, call your shame into the wind. The noise was unbearable. The message was clear. You were no longer part of them. And worse, if the favor had been pledged before God and you still refused to repay it, you might be cursed during Mass, by name. The priest, under pressure from the injured party, would invoke your name in Latin and condemn you before the altar, not excommunicated, but something more frightening, publicly shamed before heaven. You'd be forbidden from communion until you made it right, and everyone would know. Because the curse wasn't whispered, it was spoken aloud with the eyes of God and the community upon you. In England, in the 14th century, chroniclers recorded that villagers who refused to return a favor of protection or shelter could be paraded in mock processions, forced to wear robes made of sackcloth, with signs hung around their necks. Ingrate, false debtor, oath breaker. You weren't just mocked, you were erased. Refusal to honor a favor was seen as a kind of moral disease, a contagion that could rot the soul of a community, because if one person could betray a sacred promise, what stopped the next? So, the punishment had to be loud, visible, lasting. In Scandinavian villages, you might be given a shame name, an insulting title that replaced your real one in daily speech. People would no longer call you Thomas or Ingrid. You'd be known as Stoneback, one who turned their back, or Cold Hand, one who forgot warmth. And these names stuck for generations. Even your children might bear the burden, because a debt unpaid was not erased with time. It echoed until it was fulfilled. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about gold or coin. It was about honor economy, a culture where favors were more valuable than money, where trust was your only currency. And once spent, it had to be paid in full. Failed to do so, and the punishment could follow you into death. In some Italian towns, those who died with an unpaid favor attached to their name would have their graves marked differently. A broken cross, a tilted stone, and sometimes no burial at all. Because if you died in disgrace, you were not worthy of rest. Even now, in the margins of old church records, you can find names struck through in ink. Notes scrawled beside them. Refused to return aid. Did not repay the widow's kindness. Shamed during vigil. They are reminders of what it meant to live in a world where favors weren't forgotten, where reputation could rise or fall on a single act of gratitude, or a single act of betrayal, and all it took was one moment of silence, one denial, one forgotten promise, and the hammer of shame would fall. Favors were often traded like currency, without your consent. In the medieval world, coins weren't the only currency. Sometimes, a sack of grain could be enough. Other times, it was a strong back, or a silent favor. But one of the most terrifying forms of currency was invisible. You couldn't touch it, you couldn't count it, and you couldn't refuse it. It was you. Because favors, personal obligations, were often traded behind closed doors, passed from one man to another like property, without your knowledge, without your consent. And once the favor changed hands, your life no longer belonged to the man you owed. It belonged to someone else, someone more powerful, and they could demand anything. Imagine this. Years ago, your neighbor helped your family survive. He gave you food during a famine, or sheltered you from a traveling band of raiders. You were grateful. You carried that debt silently, waiting for the day he might ask for something small in return. But that day never came. Instead, your neighbor sells the debt, not for money, but to earn favor from someone higher up, a merchant, a local knight, a land steward. He says, "I know someone who owes me. He's strong, loyal, quiet." He'll do what you ask. And just like that, the obligation shifts. Now they own your loyalty. And when they come knocking, the favor you never agreed to becomes a noose around your neck. You say, "I never promised you anything." They reply, "But you're bound. He gave me your debt." And the village will agree, because that's how the system works. Favors were currency, and people were assets. In this world, to be helped was a risk, because help came with strings, and those strings could be sold. And once sold, you couldn't cut them, you couldn't argue, you couldn't run, because refusal meant exile, dishonor, or worse, violent consequences. This wasn't rare, it was normal. Farmers, blacksmiths, even women who were once gifted cloth or safety or kindness, years later, they'd be told, "You owe Lord Darien now. He bought your favor from your cousin. He expects your silence, or your service, or your land." And no matter how absurd it sounded, you obeyed, because the debt was no longer yours to manage. It had been transferred, and the new owner didn't always ask nicely. In many cases, these gifted debts were used to build private networks of loyalty. A wealthy landowner could own dozens of such favors, given to him by priests, merchants, or lesser lords who passed their social currency up the chain. It wasn't just economics, it was power, and it created a web of invisible ownership. Men who had never met you could command your time, your labor, your silence, even your complicity in crimes, simply because someone else cashed in your name. Some were ordered to fight, others to spy, others to give up their daughters for marriage or service. And the most chilling part, you didn't even have to know it had happened. The debt could be traded without a word. One day you're free, the next you belong to a stranger. And there was no law against it, because these weren't contracts, they weren't official. They were older than the king's writ, deeper than parchment. They lived in the bones of the village, the whispered agreements, the old stories that said, "A favor owed is a favor owned, and a favor owned can be passed." You weren't a person anymore. You were a token, a favor with legs. And the moment your name became useful, it could be handed off. Sometimes these trades were strategic. A man wanted influence, so he gave 3 of his favors to a local warlord. In return, he got protection, or information, or power. He didn't tell the people he gave away. He didn't have to. And when the warlord came collecting, no one dared protest. Because if you refused, you didn't just betray one man, you broke the chain of trust that held your entire life together. There are records of peasants who tried to escape these traded debts, who ran to another village, who begged for protection. But even then, the wait followed. Their names were marked, their stories poisoned. "He doesn't repay what he owes," they'd whisper. "Don't help him. Don't trust him." And in a world where trust was your only shield, that was fatal. Sometimes, a favor from 10 years ago could destroy your family today. Even death wasn't protection. There are tales of sons being told, "Your father owed me. I helped him build his house. Now I need you to carry my message, or give up your grain, or hide something for me." And the son obeys, because a father's debt did not die with him. It could be passed, like a title or a curse. This wasn't crime, it was custom. This wasn't corruption, it was culture. And it taught everyone one quiet lesson. Be careful who helps you, because the price of being saved is that one day someone else might own your debt, and you won't know what they want until it's far too late to refuse. Helping someone once could turn you into their servant forever. In the ancient world, kindness could cost you your freedom, not as the one receiving help, but as the one giving it. Because helping someone once, lending a tool, offering shelter, giving them a meal or a bed, wasn't just a gesture of goodwill. It was a declaration, a signal, one that could follow you for the rest of your life. Because in many early societies, to help someone was to adopt them, to take them under your protection, legally, spiritually, and socially. And once they were under you, they might never leave. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the logic of survival in pre-modern communities, when central governments were weak or non-existent. Law didn't come from a courtroom. It came from custom, kinship, and obligation. People didn't rely on police to enforce rights. They relied on powerful households, family names, and the invisible thread of reciprocity. So, if you loaned your neighbor a plow during a harsh spring, or took in a runaway during a storm, or gave a warm bed to someone whose home had burned, you weren't just being kind. You were taking responsibility, and they, in turn, could invoke your protection for years, sometimes for life. In ancient Germanic law, this was formalized through the concept of Mund, a household protection structure. If someone entered your home and ate your food, you became their protector, and in some cases their legal representative. They could invoke your name if accused. They could plead your loyalty if attacked. You didn't just help them, you owned their fate, and if you tried to back out, you were seen as betraying your own. In medieval Europe, this got even messier. A poor laborer might spend one night in your barn, then claim, under custom, that he was now part of your estate, that he was a dependent, protected by your household, bound to your land, not a slave, not a servant, but something in between. And when tax collectors came, you were responsible for him. When legal disputes emerged, you were summoned as his voice. The moment he entered your home, your name and his were stitched together in the eyes of the village. Even worse, this system wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. In many early Christian communities, offering hospitality was sacred. If you gave someone shelter, you weren't just helping them, you were embodying the teachings of Christ. But the person you helped could then claim you. They could say, "This man took me in. He fed me. He clothed me. He is my brother now." And who were you to argue? To deny them after such mercy was not only a social sin, it was seen as spiritual corruption, a betrayal of the divine. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, similar rules existed under tribal codes. Offer water to a traveler in the desert, and they could claim your hospitality for life. If someone slept under your roof for 3 nights, they might be considered under your tribal protection. That meant you defended them in disputes, avenged them in war, and provided for them in peace. The boundary between helper and hostage blurred, because refusing to care for someone you once helped wasn't seen as neutrality. It was abandonment. And abandonment could stain your name for generations. This pattern even reached into feudal Japan. In samurai households, if a peasant or ronin was taken in, even briefly, they could invoke your house's name for honor, food, and even vengeance. Helping them once could entangle your family in blood feuds that lasted years. And so, mercy became a kind of servitude, a trap, not for the one in need, but for the one who gave. And it wasn't always malicious. Sometimes, people truly believed they were now bonded, that your kindness was a divine signal of belonging. They didn't see it as manipulation. They saw it as fate. You saved them. That meant you were meant to protect them. And if you refused, they felt betrayed, and worse, so did the community. Because to break such a bond wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. In a world built on trust, breaking trust was poison. So what began as a single quiet act, "Here, take my blanket," could spiral into decades of expectation, of dependence, of shared reputation. And the longer it lasted, the harder it was to cut loose. You were no longer just someone who gave. You were someone who could never stop giving. Because the moment you did, you lost not just a dependent, you lost your honor. Refusing to return a favor could get you banished from the village. In the medieval village, survival wasn't about strength. It wasn't about wealth. It was about loyalty. When the harvest failed, when the well ran dry, when raiders crept across the fields, no one survived alone. You needed neighbors. You needed protection. You needed favors. And if someone gave you one, you owed them everything. Because in that world, refusing to return a favor wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. It was betrayal. And betrayal had a price. You could be banished, exiled, cast out, not by law, but by the very people you lived beside. This wasn't just about etiquette, it was about trust, the fragile glue that held a village together. Every borrowed tool, every helped harvest, every time someone watched your child or fed you in winter. These weren't small acts, they were contracts, unwritten, unspoken, unbreakable. And if you broke them, you became a threat, not just to the person you wronged, but to the balance of the entire community. Because if one person refused to repay a favor, who else might? What would stop the whole system from collapsing? So the village acted quickly. Sometimes it started with whispers. People stopped greeting you in the morning. Your name stopped coming up during planning meetings. A neighbor who used to share firewood suddenly forgot you existed. But if the debt was deep, if the favor you failed to return had saved someone's life, or fed a family, or mended a broken roof in the middle of winter, the response could be harsher. You could be called to the commons, made to stand before the elders, not to face a trial, but to explain yourself. Why didn't you help him back when his child was sick? Why didn't you lend your oxen during planting season when he had given you seed last spring? Why didn't you answer the call when she needed help burying her mother, after she fed you during famine? And in that moment, your answer wouldn't matter, because the village had already decided you broke the code, and the punishment wasn't imprisonment. It wasn't a fine, it was banishment. You were told to leave, to take your family, to walk. No guards escorted you, no violence was used, but the silence, that was worse. No one would trade with you. No one would offer shelter. You became a ghost before you even crossed the fields. And if you stayed, you lived in shame. Children were told not to play with yours. Your tools were returned, untouched. No one came to help during storms. If wolves came in the night, no one listened to your screams. You were not part of the village anymore, even if your body remained. This wasn't just superstition. It was survival logic. In a world where there was no government to protect you, no social service to catch you, no courtroom to resolve disputes, mutual obligation was everything. You helped others not because you were kind, but because one day you'd need them to help you. Break that chain, and the village couldn't trust you. And if they couldn't trust you, they couldn't afford to keep you. Even minor favors mattered. A man once failed to return a favor after a neighbor loaned him seed during a drought. He claimed his field didn't yield enough. He claimed he was too sick to help rebuild the neighbor's fence. But the village remembered how he had danced at the harvest feast, how he had traded grain to a traveler, and in the eyes of the people, he had chosen not to repay. He wasn't dragged out. No torches, no mobs. But when his roof collapsed in the next storm, no one came. His children grew pale. His wife begged in the next village over. Eventually they left, not because they were forced, but because they had been erased. This was the quiet brutality of rural life. There was no official punishment, just removal from the circle, the invisible network that kept people alive. And sometimes, people tried to return. Years later, after famine or war, they came back to the village, older, humbler, with tears in their eyes. But the silence met them again. Because once you broke the bond, once you proved yourself untrustworthy, forgiveness was rare. In that world, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was sacred. Because one favor could save your life, and one failure to return it could take everything else away. Favors were used to secure military recruits without pay. In a world where war was constant and loyalty was life, favors were never just kind gestures, they were leverage. And sometimes, they were a draft notice dressed as gratitude. Across the medieval and early modern world, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the blood-soaked plains of France, knights and lords didn't always recruit their armies with coin or contracts. They used memory, obligation, a carefully planted favor offered in your darkest hour, then harvested when you could least afford to refuse. A knight might protect your family from raiders, drive off a band of thieves threatening your livestock, or intervene when your daughter was falsely accused. And in that moment, he became your savior, your protector, your unpayable debt. But when the drums of war began to beat again, when banners rose and steel was sharpened, he would return, not for thanks, but for your son. "You owe me," he'd say, and he wouldn't be wrong. This wasn't a system written in ink. It was written in blood and memory, in honor. And honor, in the medieval world, was a binding force stronger than any royal decree. To refuse a call to arms from a man who once saved your life was to declare yourself without honor, a coward, a traitor to memory. And that shame didn't just stain you, it stained your entire family. In 13th century France, chroniclers recorded cases where peasants were pulled into military service, not through draft or duty, but through debt. One family, spared during a noble's private feud, later gave up 2 sons when the same noble went to war in Gascony. Their payment wasn't money, it was flesh. A quiet, deadly thank you. In England, the knightly class relied heavily on personal retinues, small bands of men who weren't paid soldiers, but favor-bound followers. Men who had once received land, protection, food, or mercy, and when their patron called, they were expected to arrive, with weapons, with resolve, without complaint. Sometimes the favor had been given to the father, but the son paid the price. Historical records from the 100 Years' War mention families who handed over boys as young as 15 to fight in campaigns they didn't understand. Not because they believed in the cause, but because years earlier, a noble had provided seed during a famine, or protected their village from wolves, or waived a tax. And now that favor came calling. In the fragmented kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, this tactic became especially brutal. A local knight might help a small town negotiate with a bishop, might use his influence to cancel a crippling tithe. And then, years later, he'd arrive on horseback and ask for men, volunteers. Only they weren't truly volunteering. They were paying a silent debt. And in many cases, they were sent to die. These weren't trained soldiers. They were farmers, carpenters, sons of blacksmiths and brewers. But a debt is a debt, and the battlefield doesn't wait for experience. Even in the Ottoman Empire, similar dynamics emerged. A cavalryman might rescue a village from bandits. In return, the village would promise a young man to serve as an aide, a porter, or a scout. The boy would march across deserts and mountains, unpaid, sometimes unarmed, because his father once survived thanks to the mercy of a sword. It wasn't just manipulation, it was a cultural trap. Because in the eyes of many societies, repaying a favor wasn't just expected, it was sacred. And refusing a warrior who had once protected you was seen as the lowest form of betrayal. It didn't matter that the favor was given without conditions. The condition was always implied, and some knights knew this. They gave favors not out of generosity, but as long-term investments, planting acts of mercy in desperate soil, knowing that in a few years they'd return to harvest sons for their banners. There's a chilling story from 15th century Hungary, where a landless noble helped defend a village from mercenaries. Years later, he arrived at the same village with a broken army and demanded 30 men. He got 18. The rest fled into the mountains, chased not by soldiers, but by shame. In Japan, the samurai had similar expectations. A ronin, masterless warrior, might offer protection to a peasant village during a bandit raid. And though no formal agreement was made, the act bound the villagers to him. When he next rode out to seek vengeance or glory, he would return and request assistance. And if they refused, their crops might burn. Their honor, definitely. And what makes it more tragic is that many of these families complied willingly. Not because they wanted to send their sons into battle, but because they couldn't bear the dishonor of saying no, of being the one who broke the chain of obligation. Because in their world, that shame was worse than death. It fractured communities, pitted families against each other. If one house answered the call and another didn't, suspicion took root. Were they cowards? Were they ungrateful? Could they be trusted in the next harvest, in the next prayer, in the next raid? And this invisible web of debt wove through every layer of society, quiet, deadly, binding. It's easy to look back and call it manipulation. But for many, it was simply the cost of survival. A sword kept away from your door today could mean your child was marched off tomorrow. But what choice did you have? Say no and risk your land, your name, your village, or say yes and never see your son again? Because in the world of favors, nothing was free, and the currency wasn't silver. It was sacrifice. So the next time someone says, "He did us a favor," remember this. Once, a favor didn't just protect your family. It took part of it. You might be forced to marry off a daughter as payback. Your family was starving. The fields had frozen early. The cattle died weeks ago. And your father's debts, owed to a local noble or merchant, had grown louder than the wind. There was no grain left, no coin, no options. Then came the knock. A man in furs, or armor, or robes of wealth, with bread, salt, and protection. He gave it freely, or so he said. The family wept with gratitude, a miracle, a second chance. But nothing in the old world came without weight. And in that moment, even if no one said it aloud, a transaction had begun. Not of gold, of blood. Because months or years later, that noble returned. Not with soldiers, not with threats, just a name, a proposal. He, or his son, would take your daughter, and that would be the debt repaid. It didn't matter if she was promised to another. It didn't matter if she wept, protested, begged. In many parts of medieval Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, a daughter was not her own. She was currency. She was honor. She was a vessel for loyalty and alliance, and when your family owed a favor, she became the repayment. This happened more often than history likes to admit. In feudal France, a minor noble might give a poor farming family food during a harsh winter. He would not ask for coin. He didn't need to. Because when spring came, he'd visit and speak of joining blood. One daughter, one marriage. Refusal would be ungrateful, and ungratefulness was dangerous. Because without that noble's protection, your land might be seized, your son conscripted, your family name dragged through the mud. You might be labeled oath breakers, those who accept favor but deny repayment. So you look at your daughter. You tell her gently. She shakes her head. You speak of duty, of sacrifice, of survival. And she disappears into a marriage that was never hers. Sometimes, the noble wouldn't even marry her. He would give her to a cousin, a captain, a brother whose first wife had died, or worse. He'd marry her himself, despite being twice her age, or cruel, or visibly sick. In Renaissance Italy, records show nobles demanding daughters from indebted households, claiming them as wives or concubines, with the excuse that gratitude must be honored. In many cases, refusal led to eviction, land seizure, or public ruin. You wouldn't just lose your daughter, you'd lose everything. And the church? It rarely intervened. If the marriage served social cohesion, if the favor had been public, if the family had accepted the gift, then the church might even bless it. Because a daughter's will was not the priority. The restoration of balance was. In Ottoman courts, there are documented cases where poor families who received food or military protection were later pressured to give their daughters in marriage, not to nobles, but to officers, guards, and landowners. The reasoning was always the same. The favor saved your lives. Now return the honor. Even in early colonial settlements where resources were scarce and alliances vital, women were sometimes married off to benefactors from other families or tribes. For the good of the community, they were told, for the preservation of peace. But underneath the political language was something far more brutal: coercion. A daughter reduced to repayment. Imagine being that girl. You remember the man who gave your father food when you were small. You remember his eyes lingering too long. You remember the way your mother lowered her head when his name was spoken. And one day, your father sits you down. He says it's time. And everything you are, your dreams, your heart, your future, is folded into the shape of someone else's gratitude and signed away. No parchment needed, just silence and shame. Because to protest would make your family look ungrateful. And in a world ruled by honor, that could be fatal. Reputation was survival, and so you went. In a dress not of your choosing, to a house not of your making, to a man not of your imagining. Because someone once did your family a kindness, and now your body was the repayment. History books tell the stories of kings and treaties, but in the margins, there are girls whose lives were traded like debts, whose names were never recorded, whose weddings were called alliances, whose suffering was called gratitude, and all because someone once brought bread to a starving family and came back later to collect. Travelers would demand shelter based on old favors owed. In the medieval world, the past never stayed buried. Every favor lived longer than the one who gave it. Every debt could outlive its original owner, and every doorstep was a door to history. Because sometimes a knock in the night wasn't from a friend. It was from a stranger, a traveler, muddy boots, or in hollow eyes, a horse with broken shoes. And when you asked what they wanted, they said only this: your grandfather owed mine a favor. And just like that, your home was no longer your own. Because in that world, debt was eternal. Help once given, even across generations, could be cashed in by blood. A man you've never met might arrive at your gate and demand food, shelter, fire, or even your only horse. And you couldn't simply say no, because this wasn't just a request. It was an inheritance of obligation, of loyalty, of danger. In a world without receipts, stories carried more weight than documents. If a man claimed your father once sheltered his during a plague, or your uncle saved his brother during a raid, the village expected you to honor it, even if you didn't remember, even if you had nothing to give. Refusal wasn't just rude, it was a threat, a violation of the ancient trust that kept roads safe and houses warm. And if word spread that you'd turned someone away, someone invoking the sacred law of debt, you weren't just shamed. You were marked, because that traveler might not come alone. He might return with others, a cousin, a sword, or worse, a reputation. He doesn't honor debts, they'd whisper. His family forgets. And in a world built on favors, forgetting was betrayal. Sometimes these travelers were honest. Sometimes they were desperate. Sometimes they were opportunists, bandits in disguise, con men who knew how to manipulate the unspoken codes of obligation. They would invent stories, half true, half whispered, and count on your fear of dishonor to give them what they needed. And often, it worked, because people were afraid of curses, of revenge, of being blamed for a debt they didn't repay. You might be poor, barely feeding your own family, and still, you opened your door, let them in, shared your fire, your bread, even your bed if they asked, because saying no wasn't just a decision, it was a gamble. There are stories, real stories, of households burned in the night after refusing a traveler, of horses stolen, children taken, entire farms harassed by unknown men with long memories and short tempers. And though no one could prove it, everyone understood. A debt had been claimed and refused. And now payment had come in another form. The worst part? You couldn't always verify the claim. The person you supposedly owed might be long dead. The story might be twisted. But to doubt the word of someone invoking ancestral debt was dangerous. It made you look dishonorable, and that reputation could follow you forever. So you gave, and you hoped it was enough. Sometimes this system protected people, travelers who had no home but could survive by calling in old bonds. It was a form of social insurance, an invisible network that kept the roads alive. That said, if someone helped me, someone will help you. But it also bred fear, because the line between obligation and exploitation blurred quickly. And when someone arrived claiming your family owed them, they weren't asking. They were taking. And if you resisted, you risked violence, or banishment, or worse, abandonment. Because when you broke the chain of honor, the village might turn its back on you. Helpers don't help the dishonorable. Debts don't protect the forgetful. And in a world where famine, plague, and war could arrive at any moment, isolation was death. So people complied, not because they trusted, but because they couldn't afford not to. Your home wasn't a fortress. It was a node in a web of favors, threats, and ancient bargains. And when that traveler appeared, wet from the rain, silent and staring, you didn't see a man. You saw a ghost of an old agreement, and ghosts in that world demanded respect. You gave him bread. You gave him shelter. You prayed he'd leave peacefully. And when he did, you marked the day in silence, because who knew when your name would be spoken next? Not in your lifetime, but years from now, by someone else, standing in someone else's doorway, asking for what they believe you owe. You could be bound to join a cult or secret order. In the ancient and medieval world, not all debts were visible. Some were whispered, carried in silence, sealed not by blood, but by favors. A stranger helps you, wealthy, well-dressed, eyes like fire. He saves you from a gang in the alley, pays your way across a dangerous border, offers you food when no one else would. You ask him why. He only says, "You'll understand later." And later always comes. Because some gifts aren't just generous, they're hooks. They pull you into something darker, something hidden. You don't realize it at first. You feel grateful, lucky, even blessed. But then you get the message. We need a favor in return. It's not money. It's not labor. It's something else. A meeting in a remote building. A symbol you must wear. A chant you must speak. A vow you must make in the presence of others who never speak above a whisper. This was the path for many who found themselves bound, not just in friendship or service, but in cults or secret religious orders. All because of one mysterious act of kindness. History is full of examples. In late antiquity, mystery religions were widespread across the Roman Empire. Cults dedicated to Mithras, Isis, Dionysus. They often spread through personal invitation. Initiates were not recruited. They were indebted. A soldier spared in battle might be invited to a Mithraic ceremony in gratitude. A merchant saved from debt might be asked to donate goods to a hidden shrine. And slowly what began as thanks became initiation. In the medieval world, it got more dangerous. Secret orders like the Cathars, the Gnostics, or later, the Templars, sometimes welcomed followers through quiet acts of rescue. A noble might save a peasant from unjust punishment, but only if he agreed to attend a gathering. A monk might offer forbidden knowledge in exchange for secrecy. That secrecy became ritual. That ritual became life. And if you tried to walk away, you risked more than guilt. You risked punishment. Because once you knew their names, once you knew their symbols, you were one of them, whether you wanted to be or not. In some rural villages across medieval Europe, underground sects would embed themselves in local life. A baker helps you during the famine, a healer cures your child, a wealthy traveler pays your tax debt, and only afterward do you learn they're not who they claim to be. They're part of something older, something strange. They call it the path, or the brotherhood, or the circle. And now that you've been helped, you've been chosen. You're asked to swear silence, to show up at the edge of the forest when the bell rings, to repeat words you don't fully understand, to believe, not in a God you were raised with, but in something hidden beneath the surface of the world. And if you refuse, they remind you, we saved you, we kept you safe, and all we ask is loyalty. It doesn't matter if you're afraid, you said yes when you took their gift. The spiritual landscape of pre-modern Europe was full of these quiet cults. Many of them claimed to be Christian. Others cloaked themselves in older traditions, pagan, shamanic, astrological, and they often grew not by force, but by favors, because a favor creates loyalty, and loyalty, twisted the right way, becomes submission. In 17th century Italy, certain secret societies operated in the shadows of the church. They would aid widows, rescue orphans, or fund poor artisans, on one condition: that you pass their message to others, that you carry a symbol, that you never speak of where your luck came from. And those who betrayed the secret were said to vanish. This was the power of the unknown. Once someone owns your gratitude, they can reshape your path. And even today, cult psychology works this way. It begins with a gift, a compliment, an answer to a prayer, a coincidence that feels too perfect. You're given something when you need it most, and now you owe. Not legally, but emotionally. And that is the strongest bond of all. Because once someone helps you when no one else will, you'll walk into almost anything for them. Even darkness, even ruin, even death. The history of cults is not a story of evil masterminds and foolish followers. It's a story of need, of vulnerability, of help that costs more than you thought. So, next time a stranger helps you, remember, not every favor is free. Some are invitations to a door that cannot be closed. Healers might demand lifelong silence or loyalty. In the dark corners of medieval life, where disease stalked through villages and death came quietly in the night, there were those who knew things no one else dared to speak. They weren't priests, they weren't surgeons, they were healers, root workers, herb women, men who spoke to bones, women who read illness from the color of your spit, mysterious, feared, and needed. And when they saved you, you didn't just owe them thanks, you owed them your silence, or your loyalty, sometimes both, because a healer's gift wasn't freely given. It came with shadows. They might pull you back from the brink of fever, break a curse no priest could touch, make a poultice that stilled your tremors when everyone else had prepared your grave. But afterward, when you returned in gratitude, they gave you a warning. Tell no one, or I will undo what was done. It sounds like superstition, but this was real. This was power. And in many villages, it was obeyed without question, because healers weren't just medicine men. They were part myth, part terror, part salvation, and crossing them was like crossing death itself. Their knowledge wasn't written, it was passed in whispers. Plant lore, blood knowledge, rituals that hovered between magic and medicine. If you revealed their secrets, even accidentally, you threatened their survival, because one wrong word could bring the church, or the Lord's men, or a jealous rival down on them. So they protected themselves with fear. And if that didn't work, they demanded loyalty. Fierce, unquestioning, lifelong. You were expected to show up when they called, to carry messages, to vouch for them if they were accused, to offer food or shelter, or even protection, years after they had healed you, because they had touched your body when it was vulnerable. They had seen your wounds, your secrets, your death face. They had held you in the moment between breath and silence, and that, to them, was a bond that didn't expire. There are recorded accounts from 15th century Poland where local wise women demanded that healed villagers never disclose the herbs used or risk the illness returning. In some rural parts of Germany, a man who had been cured of seizures was required to bring the healer a bottle of wine every winter solstice. He stopped once, and the fits returned. Coincidence? Maybe. But no one in that village ever stopped again. In England, during the plague years, some healers offered shadow cures. They would heal only if you agreed never to speak their name. They worked at night. They demanded your oath by fire or by blood. And if you told others who helped you, it was said they could summon your fever back with a single breath. The church condemned these practices, but they could never quite stop them. Because when a child was dying, or your skin broke into sores no priest could cure, you went to whoever could save you. And afterward, you kept your mouth shut. Some even carried tokens, a small stone, a bone charm, a black ribbon. If the healer gave you one, it meant the pact was sealed. Lose it, disrespect it, and the illness would return. And some didn't stop at curses. If you revealed them, they revealed you. They might speak of the abortion you begged them for, the illegitimate child they helped you deliver, the poison they gave you for your violent husband. You weren't just breaking silence, you were breaking your protection. Because you weren't their patient anymore. You were a liability. And in many villages, the fear of the healer was stronger than the fear of the Lord. They walked freely. They were left untouched during disputes. Even soldiers hesitated to question them, because too many had watched one walk into a fevered hut and emerge with a child who survived. And all they asked for in return? Lifelong silence, or lifelong allegiance. And people gave it, not out of gratitude, out of fear, out of awe. Because in a world without doctors, without certainty, without mercy, the healer wasn't just a savior. They were a god with dirt under their nails. And once they'd saved your life, they owned a part of it. Barons could demand taxes to be collected by you in return. In the feudal world, power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it came dressed in velvet, in gold rings and wolfish smiles. And sometimes it came offering help, a kind word, a small favor, a leniency from a baron who could have crushed you, but didn't. He waived your rent during a harsh winter, allowed your oxen to graze on his lord's land, protected your cousin from conscription, a mercy, yes, but mercy with teeth, because a baron's favor was never free, and one of the cruelest repayments he could demand was for you to become the most hated man in your village, a tax collector. Not officially. You weren't given a title or a coin purse or a seat in court, but you were ordered, by whispered command or written scroll, to assist in the collection of dues, to knock on your neighbor's door, to count their grain, to list their chickens, and to bring it back. For the baron. Even if your neighbor was starving. Even if your cousin had only one goat left. Even if the priest begged you not to take what little was left of the church's bread. You had no choice. Because the man asking you to do this wasn't just a noble. He was the one who once saved your family, gave you land, shielded you from worse. And now, his favor had ripened. It was time to pay. Throughout medieval Europe, this was a quiet tactic, rarely written in law, but enforced in blood and silence. Barons, especially in distant rural holdings, often lacked the manpower to collect taxes from every tenant, every peasant, every dusty farm. So they conscripted help from those who owed them, from men like you. In England's late feudal period, manorial lords were known to delegate tax collection to peasants who had recently received a gift or reprieve. The logic was simple. You owe me. Now go knock on doors for me. And if those doors refused to open, if angry neighbors threw dung or blades, that was your problem, not his. Records from the 13th century show village disputes erupting when one man, previously poor, suddenly trusted, started demanding barley and bread on behalf of his lord. The villagers didn't care that he was forced to do it. To them, he was the traitor, the collector, the betrayer of the poor. And what's worse, Sometimes the Baron didn't even protect you. If things turned violent, if your house was burned or your son beaten for collecting what the Baron demanded, he might simply shrug. After all, you were never formally his agent. You were just repaying a debt. In Scotland, during the clan wars and Highland land disputes, there are records of lairds pressuring villagers to collect rents or taxes from other families in exchange for favors rendered, a mule provided, a sickness treated, a roof repaired. Those chosen often lived in fear, caught between their obligation to the laird and the fury of their neighbors. One account from 1452 tells of a man named Cormac who was spared during a raid and later tasked with collecting dried meat and cloth from nearby households. Days later, he was found hanged in his barn, his hands still holding the laird's parchment. In Eastern Europe under serfdom, similar patterns emerged. Nobles would occasionally elevate a peasant temporarily, giving them tools, seed, or horses during famine. Then, seasons later, that same man would be expected to bring back taxes from the village, to count wheat, to weigh salt, to list what everyone owed. The others hated him. But to the Lord, he was nothing more than a convenient debt repayment. Even the church sometimes exploited this system. A bishop might grant a farmer's son access to education or medicine, then later ask the father to assist the tithe collectors, which meant standing beside armed men as they stripped a neighbor's field, which meant lying awake at night, knowing you were hated not by strangers, but by those who once helped you. And the danger wasn't just social. In many villages, tax collectors, especially unofficial ones, were cursed, ambushed, or worse. Superstitions painted them as agents of greed, demons in human form. A peasant who once sat at your fire might spit in your face. A woman who once nursed your child might now call you carrion-hearted, not because she misunderstood, but because she understood too well. You had become the Baron's mouth, his eyes, his hand. And once you were marked, there was no going back. Some tried to escape, fled into forests, vanished into cities, but most stayed, because they still needed the Baron, and because the favor, once accepted, had bound them tighter than any chain. What began as kindness had become control, and this reveals the most brutal truth. The favor wasn't the beginning of friendship. It was the first link in your leash, because barons didn't need to beat you into service. They just needed you to feel grateful, to feel chosen. And when the time came, that gratitude would become your collar. And so, across generations, men were turned against their own. Not with threats, not with swords, but with a memory of help, followed by a whisper, "You owe me. Now go and collect." Declining a favor repayment was seen as an act of war. He saved your life in battle. Or maybe he defended your lands when enemies circled. Or maybe, quietly, behind palace doors, he spoke your name at the right moment and spared your downfall. It wasn't done with coin. It wasn't done with contract. It was a favor. And now, he wants it repaid. Not with gold, not with gratitude, but with loyalty, troops, land, blood. And when you hesitate, when you delay, when you say, "It's not the right time," everything changes. Because in noble courts, declining to repay a favor was not just an insult, it was a declaration of war. In the brutal political chessboard of medieval Europe, feudal Japan, Mongol alliances, and Byzantine courts, favors were rarely gestures of kindness. They were weapons, given with open hands and blades behind the back. If you accepted one, you bound your name, your family, your power to theirs. And if you failed to return that favor when called, you marked yourself a traitor, not by law, but by honor code. In 13th century France, a duke once protected a rival's castle from invading knights. 3 years later, when he asked for support in his own war, that rival refused, citing unreadiness. Within days, messengers were dispatched, alliances turned, and two families that had once dined together became mortal enemies, because favor was a sacred currency. To deny repayment was to fracture the balance of power and invite revenge. Noble society ran on a fragile code, one of mutual debt, silence, and expectation. Lords gave horses to barons, barons gave troops to kings, kings gave titles to friends, but all of it came with the unspoken rule: return the favor or be ruined. In feudal Japan, the samurai class treated political debts with the severity of life oaths. If you refused to assist a former ally who had once aided your family, even if the cost was unjust, you risked not only being cast out of the clan, but targeted for assassination. The shame of refusing a repayment was often considered worse than defeat in battle, because refusing meant you could not be trusted. And in a world where alliances were everything, trust was more valuable than armies. In 15th century Italy, the Medici were masters of favor politics. They would fund a rival's art, support their children's education, or protect a disgraced relative from arrest. And then, quietly, precisely, they would call the debt due. Refuse? You wouldn't just lose your protection. You'd lose your livelihood. Your alliances would collapse. And one morning, you'd wake up to rumors whispered in the court of theft, heresy, treason. Because the favor wasn't repaid. And now you had to pay in reputation. Or blood. In the Holy Roman Empire, records show entire skirmishes beginning over neglected obligation. Two nobles would stand in court, one accusing the other of failing to return a war debt. The accused would deny the debt's weight. The accuser would challenge him to duel, and men would die, not for gold, but for honor unpaid. This wasn't just medieval drama. Even in early Islamic caliphates, political favor was sacred. When a vizier supported your rise to power, it was understood. One day you would support him, or his bloodline. To refuse was to invite assassination or rebellion. In royal courts from Byzantium to Baghdad, the deadliest words were not, "I hate you." They were, "You owe me." Because once the favor was named, it could not be ignored, and once denied, it could not be forgiven. Sometimes kings would test loyalty by fabricating a favor, sending a symbolic gift in wartime, or offering troops for a short siege. And when they later demanded repayment, the real question wasn't about the value, it was about submission. Would you bend? Would you obey? If not, they knew where you stood, and armies would march. Even the Crusades were tangled in this web. When one ruler offered ships or men to another, the return favor might not come for years, but it would come. And when it did, refusal meant betrayal, not just of a man, but of Christendom, of God's chain of loyalty. And that meant excommunication, or war. These were not transactional cultures, they were honor cultures, and honor, once tarnished, could only be cleansed by vengeance. That's why you couldn't simply walk away from a political favor. It followed you, lingered in your halls, echoed in your allies' eyes, because everyone watched, everyone knew. He helped you once, you did not help him. And now, anything done to you was justified, because you broke the oldest law of all. The debt must be repaid, not with thanks, but with allegiance, with land, with your son's sword, with your daughter's hand. Whatever the favor demands, fail, and the blood would come. Not because they hated you, but because the world you lived in required it. People used favors to steal property through manipulation. In the medieval world, trust wasn't a virtue, it was a vulnerability. And favors, those sacred gestures of kindness, could be turned into traps, silent snares disguised as friendship. Because sometimes, the person who asked you to help wasn't desperate. They were patient. And what began as a favor, just holding land or watching over livestock, could end with your ruin. This is how manipulation lived in plain sight, and how countless villagers lost everything without ever lifting a weapon. Imagine your neighbor comes to you one day, humble, grateful. He's traveling for business, or leaving the village for winter. Maybe he's joining a pilgrimage. "Friend," he says, "would you mind holding my ox while I'm gone? Just feed him, keep him safe. I'll be back in a month." Of course, you agree. It's a favor, it's kindness. And maybe he once helped you in a time of need. Maybe he gave you a tool or warned you of bandits, so you nod. You take the ox, you care for it. A month passes, then two, no word. Then one morning, the sheriff comes, not to thank you, to arrest you, because your neighbor has accused you of stealing. The ox you held in trust is now claimed as stolen, and with no paper, no witnesses, no law in your favor, you're guilty. Maybe he even shows up, now returned, pointing at his missing property and shaking his head. "I trusted him," he says. "He turned on me." And the village believes it. Because in a world without written contracts, memory was law, and law could be bought. These scams were subtle, clever, and devastating. Some involved livestock. Others involved tools, carts, or grain. But the worst involved land. A dying man might ask you to hold his field while his son came of age. A friend might ask you to temporarily manage their plot while they dealt with illness. You worked the land, you sowed it, you harvested it. But years later, that same man, or his family, might return and accuse you of seizing it. You'd show the sweat on your hands. They'd show the memory of a favor. And the favor would win. Because memory was sacred. And a man who said, "I trusted him," carried more weight than one who said, "I worked for it." And in many courts, especially in rural villages, the word of a landowning family was believed over the word of a poor farmer. So it didn't matter how long you held the land. It didn't matter what labor you poured into it. One lie could steal it all back. And the people who used these tricks, they weren't bandits. They were respected, cunning, polished, quiet. They played the long game. They made small sacrifices, offering trust, asking for help, only to turn that trust into accusation. And when the time came, they didn't shout. They filed complaints, quiet ones, whispered ones that made you look like the ungrateful thief, the traitor, the one who abused a favor. And the worst part? No one defended you. Because everyone was afraid they'd be next. These scams spread like rot, silent, contagious, shrouded in civility. And because favors were so sacred, no one dared question them. If a man said you betrayed him, others nodded, even if they didn't believe it, because standing against a favor giver was dangerous. It meant you didn't respect the unwritten code, and that meant when you needed help, no one would come. You were tainted. So the victims vanished. Some fled to other towns, some tried to rebuild, others simply faded. A house once theirs now belonged to another. An ox they fed now yoked to another cart. And all because they trusted too easily. All because the person they helped knew how to weaponize memory. This wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. The kind that doesn't leave bruises, only silence, only shame, only an echo in the village square when your name is spoken and no one meets your eye. Even today, records remain. Charters rewritten, testimonies from peasant courts, disputes over loans that were never meant to be repaid, entire families displaced because someone once said, "Just hold this for me." That sentence became the knife, and trust became the wound. So people learned to be cautious, to ask for witnesses, to put hands on relics while swearing, to say, "Yes, I'll help you," but only if someone else hears it too. Because in that world, kindness without protection was weakness, and favors could be twisted into traps with no escape. So, next time someone knocks and says, "Can you just hold this for me?" ask yourself, are they in need? Or are they planting the first seed in a story that ends with your ruin? Because in the old world, trust wasn't just dangerous, it could cost you everything. Vows were publicly made before God and the community. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as a private promise. If you owed someone a favor, everyone had to know. Because returning favors wasn't just about personal honor, it was about public duty. A vow was never whispered behind closed doors. It was spoken aloud, before your neighbors, before your family, and above all, before God. You stood in the church courtyard, or at the altar, or in the village square before watchful eyes, and you declared what you owed and to whom. Whether it was a repayment, a service, or a future deed, it was now binding. Not just because you said it, but because others heard it. This was the system that governed everyday life long before written contracts were common. Your word wasn't just yours. It belonged to the entire community, and once spoken, it could not be taken back without a price. In medieval Europe, especially during the High Middle Ages, public vows were the backbone of trust. If a local lord saved your land from fire, or gave you grain during a famine, you might be expected to stand before the church and vow fealty in return. Not just obedience, but service, labor, and even generational loyalty. You would kneel, you would swear, and the priest would bless the oath, marking it not just as a social contract, but a spiritual one. To break such a vow wasn't just dishonor, it was sin. And sin wasn't a private matter. It was spoken in sermons, whispered in markets, etched into your reputation. You could be shunned, ridiculed, or publicly humiliated if you failed to repay what you owed, even if your life had changed, even if the favor had been small, because the vow wasn't about the act. It was about accountability. Your soul was now part of the deal. In some regions, like feudal France and England, public declarations were recorded by witnesses standing under God's gaze. A man who pledged to repay a noble's help might be required to touch holy relics as he swore his loyalty. A widow who received land from the church might vow aloud to keep her faith, raise her children under church law, and tithe a portion of her future crops. Failure to meet these expectations didn't just offend your benefactor, it offended the divine order. And the punishment? Public penance, or worse, public humiliation. You might be forced to kneel outside the church doors for days, barefoot, in sackcloth, begging forgiveness. You might be paraded through the streets as a vow breaker. Your name could become a warning to others. Don't trust him. His word means nothing, because trust was survival, and vows were the currency of trust. In smaller communities, the shame was even deeper. Everyone knew everyone. When you promised to repay someone, your neighbors remembered, your priest remembered, the entire village remembered. They watched. They waited. And if you didn't follow through, they judged you not just as careless, but as corrupt. Because in their eyes, if you could break your word to a man, you could break your word to God. This system wasn't limited to peasants. Nobles, merchants, even kings made vows in public. Alliances were formed on stages, with hands raised and witnesses gathered. Marriages were sealed with promises to entire towns. Debt forgiveness came only after vows of loyalty were heard by the community. Even crusaders, before leaving for war, would vow service before God and their people. If they abandoned their cause, they weren't just deserters, they were oath breakers, and the stain of that label could follow their family for generations. This is what made favors so powerful and so dangerous, because the moment you received help, the community expected you to declare it, and the moment you declared it, the entire world held you accountable. No room for secrets, no room for excuses. You either fulfilled your vow or you became a symbol of what happens when someone fails to repay the grace they've received. And worse still, some people were forced to vow. A desperate farmer, saved by a noble's grain, might be ordered to stand in church and swear lifelong labor. A woman protected by a bishop during a land dispute might have to vow her silence and obedience to the church, even if it meant giving up her rights. And once the vow was made, there was no way out. Because it wasn't just a contract. It was a sacred binding. To break it was to defy heaven, and no court could help you. Because this was not about law. It was about reputation, about faith, about the terrifying power of being watched, by man and by God. Favors were claimed centuries after they were given. In the modern world, a favor is fleeting, a kind act, a simple gesture. You help someone move a table, drive them to the doctor, maybe lend a little money, and after a thank you, the debt fades. But in the old world, in the feudal, oral, honor-bound past, a favor never died. It could sleep, for decades, even centuries, but it would wait. And one day, perhaps when you least expected it, it would be claimed. Not because you made the promise, but because someone in your bloodline did. This is the terrifying reality of medieval and early modern life. Favors were inherited. Ancient family debts were remembered across generations, passed down like cursed heirlooms, not written on paper, written in stories. And stories are harder to erase. Imagine this. Your great-great-grandfather was spared during a border raid by a neighboring lord. In return, he promised his family would offer a service when the time came. He died before that time came. But the favor? It remained alive. And now, 200 years later, a letter arrives. The descendant of that same lord demands your labor, your land, your daughter's hand in marriage, because of what your ancestor swore, and you cannot argue, because the village remembers. The tale was told at firesides. The name was etched into oral memory. And breaking that promise now, it wouldn't just dishonor you, it would dishonor your line. This wasn't fantasy. It happened. Throughout Europe, noble houses, knightly orders, even merchant families carried networks of debt and allegiance that lasted for centuries. In 14th century Sicily, a merchant family was forced to surrender half its vineyard to a noble house after a 200-year-old favor was invoked, one in which a distant ancestor had been given land during a famine. There was no record, only a ring, passed down by the noble family, and the ring was enough. In Hungary, There's a chronicle of a soldier's family being compelled to serve in a private militia 4 generations later, because their great-grandfather once received a horse and armor during a siege. They didn't ask for it, but they inherited it. And this wasn't limited to nobles. Even among peasants, favors formed a moral economy. If your grandfather was fed by my grandfather, then you owe me help rebuilding my roof. If my ancestor sheltered yours during the fire, then you will help me bury my dead. To refuse was to become a social traitor, not just to your neighbor, but to your entire ancestry. Because loyalty wasn't just personal, it was blood deep. Entire marriage alliances were formed under the weight of ancient favors. You owe us a daughter, one family might say, because ours once gave yours a dowry they never repaid. In some parts of rural France, it was believed that if an ancestral favor was broken or forgotten, it would curse not just your family, but your fields. A failed harvest, a dying cow. The elders would say, something is unpaid. Even in Eastern Orthodox communities, people were buried with tokens of unpaid favors, like coins or tools, meant to symbolically acknowledge what was still owed. The dead carried their debts, and so did the living. And sometimes, those who remembered the favors were not the ones who gave them, but the ones who received them. Imagine the guilt of inheriting a kindness you didn't ask for. A tale your mother whispered about a man who saved her grandfather's life, and now his descendant stands at your door, not asking, collecting. You were raised with the story, and that story becomes a cage. You must help, even if it ruins you, because the debt isn't yours, but the obligation is. And if you don't, the village will remember. The family will be shamed. Your children will be marked as dishonorable. That's how favors worked back then. Not as kindness, as contracts that never expired. They had no ink, only memory. They had no courts, only reputation. And when a favor was called in after generations, you were expected to answer, to serve, to give, to surrender what your ancestor borrowed, no matter how long ago. Because in that world, the past didn't stay buried, it returned, and it wanted something. So the next time you imagine the simple life of the old world, the humble peasant, the quiet village, the slow rhythms of a time long gone, remember this. Behind every barn, every wedding, every deal, there may have been a favor waiting to be claimed, not from you, but from your name, your blood, your story. And when that moment came, there was no escape, only repayment. You might be forced to carry messages through dangerous territory. Equal sign. A favor in the medieval world could save your life, but it could also end it. Because once you owed someone, once you'd accepted shelter, a warm meal, protection, or mercy, you were bound. And when they came to collect, it wasn't always gold they wanted. Sometimes it was your courage, your silence, your legs, your life. Imagine this. A knight once saved your farm from raiders. Years later, he arrives at your door holding a sealed letter. No words, just a look. And you already know what's being asked of you. You must carry this message, not across town, not across your village, but across the plague-ridden countryside, past warring lords, through outlaw-haunted woods. You must go, alone, with nothing but a name, a direction, and a promise that this will repay the debt. You dare not say no. Because honor in those days wasn't just an ideal, it was law, it was survival. To deny the man who once saved you was to declare yourself ungrateful, unworthy, dishonorable, and dishonor in the eyes of the powerful could be fatal. In medieval Europe, messages were currency, secrets, declarations of war, pleas for help, warnings. And nobles didn't always trust scribes or soldiers to carry their most sensitive letters. Sometimes they turned to someone they believed owed them, someone without power, someone expendable, someone like you. There are recorded cases from 14th century France where peasants, once granted extra seed or protection from conscription, were later summoned to carry letters between rival houses. These weren't ceremonial scrolls. They were urgent, dangerous communications sent through territory crawling with plague, thieves, or political enemies. If caught, you could be mistaken for a spy, or worse, a traitor. In the Germanic states, this practice became so common that some towns developed a bitter nickname for these favor-bound messengers, Totenlaufer, death runners. Because the journey was rarely safe, and the return was never guaranteed. And it wasn't just about avoiding soldiers or robbers. Sometimes you were asked to walk into plague zones, villages marked with black crosses on the doors, roads lined with corpses, fields where no birds sang. And still you went. Because years ago, the man who now asks this of you gave your wife medicine, or allowed your brother to avoid the gallows, or gave your starving child bread. The favor was already spent, and now the repayment had arrived. In feudal Japan, a similar practice existed among samurai and vassals. A ronin might grant mercy in a duel, or help defend a farmer from bandits. Years later, that farmer might be asked to deliver a sealed scroll to another province, through bandit territory or rival domains. Refusing wasn't just dishonorable, it was inviting retaliation. The logic was always the same. I once saved your life, now carry this, no questions. Even during the early Renaissance, as postal systems slowly emerged, nobles and merchants still relied on private messengers for sensitive or urgent delivery. A young apprentice whose father had once been spared execution might be given a message with no explanation and told to ride toward a contested border. If the letter was intercepted, torture, imprisonment, death. In many cases, the message itself could get you killed, because who would believe that a peasant or woodsman stumbled into enemy territory carrying a sealed letter purely out of debt and honor? No army commander, no patrol, no rival noble would see you as innocent. They would see you as a spy, a pawn, a threat. And yet, men and women still did it. Not because they were brave, but because they couldn't afford to say no. The psychological toll was immense. You were alone on the road, your thoughts poisoned by fear. Every tree could hide a thief. Every shadow could be a soldier. Every face you passed might be the last one you'd ever see. You carried not just a letter, but your own death sentence, tied not to crime or war, but to a favor you once accepted with gratitude. Even the church wasn't immune to this practice. Bishops and abbots, when dealing with heresies, conflicts, or forbidden knowledge, would sometimes entrust delivery to those who had once sinned and been forgiven, forcing them to atone by walking into danger for God. And if they died along the way, so be it. The debt was paid in full. And if you survived, you didn't return home a hero. You returned a changed man or woman, haunted, knowing that your life had almost ended not because of war or illness or crime, but because someone once helped you. Because kindness, in those days, came with invisible hooks. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine favors as bonds of love, gestures of goodwill. But history tells a darker story, of peasants forced to march through war zones, of farmers dying with messages clutched to their chest, of children carrying letters they couldn't read, into villages that would never see them leave. This wasn't fantasy. It was survival economics. You owed. And when you owe, you don't get to choose how you repay. So, next time someone says, "He did you a favor," remember this. Once, a single act of mercy could sentence you to walk into death, unarmed, alone, and unquestioning. Because in the eyes of the old world, the repayment of kindness wasn't comfort. It was peril. Villagers could manipulate favor debts to control each other. It always started small, a loaf of bread during a bad harvest, a patch on a broken roof, a kind word spoken to the magistrate, a child watched for a few hours while the fields were plowed, a gift left on the doorstep, no explanation, no obligation, yet. But everyone in the village understood. Favors were not free. They were investments. And some villagers, especially the elders, knew exactly how to play the long game. They didn't need titles, or soldiers, or law. All they needed was memory and patience. Because the favor given today could be called in years later, at a time of their choosing, in a form no one dared question. This was the invisible web that ruled medieval villages. Beyond the church, beyond the manor, beyond the king's law, there was a system of control built entirely on favors, and the shrewdest players weren't kings. They were grandmothers, midwives, millers, the old man who lent his donkey in spring, and the widow who shared salt in winter. They kept track of everything, not on paper, but in whispers. And when they needed labor, or bread, or silence, they remembered who owed them, and collected, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with quiet force. A young couple once received help when their child fell ill. An old healer gave them herbs, stayed the night, said prayers. Years passed. Then one day, the same healer came to their door and said, "I need your son to work my land for one season. That will settle it." And there was no refusing, because to refuse a favor repayment was to brand yourself ungrateful. Ungrateful people were cut off, shunned, unprotected, and in a world where community meant survival, that was a death sentence. So the boy went, not because he wanted to, because his family was trapped in a quiet contract no one dared violate. In villages across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, elders were often feared not because of magic, but because of memory. They remembered who had eaten their food during famine, who had slept in their barn when floods came, who had taken a tool and never returned it. And when the time came to collect, the cost was always higher than the original gift. A day's bread repaid with a week's labor, a candle in a storm repaid with a season of silence. Because the price wasn't measured in fairness, it was measured in power. And the more favors they gave, the more control they had. Some elders built entire networks this way. They would help the priest with firewood, repair a neighbor's fence, watch another's livestock for an afternoon. Not because they were generous, but because they were planting seeds. And when they bloomed, they harvested obedience. Imagine this. A widow approaches the local council. She demands that a road not be built through her garden. She has no authority, no deed. But she has something else. She looks around the room and says, "I was the one who helped bury your mother when no one else came. I fed your sister when she was sick. I held your secrets when they could have ruined you." And just like that, the road is rerouted. No one says a word. Because in villages like these, debt was weight, and some knew how to use it like a weapon. In parts of Eastern Europe, there were unwritten rules. The baker who helped you once had claim to your harvest. The shepherd who let your child ride his horse could one day take your cow. If you refused, you didn't just insult one person. You shattered the invisible chain that held the village together. That's why manipulation was so effective. Because nobody wanted to be the one who broke the code, even if the demand was unfair, even if it hurt. The worst offenders were those who never forgot a favor they gave, but always forgot the ones they received. They built their power through imbalance, always giving in public, always collecting in private. And the village saw it. But the village feared it more, because these people were not cruel by blade. They were cruel by memory. They could destroy your reputation with one well-timed reminder. They could ruin your marriage by whispering about a favor you hadn't repaid. They could stop your child's baptism, your access to land, your ability to survive, with one look. And sometimes, they didn't even ask directly. They simply reminded you, "It's been many years since I lent your father my ox." And you knew what that meant. Your hands would tighten, your mouth would close, and you'd say yes. Not because you were afraid of the person, but because you were afraid of what your refusal would mean. Villages were not ruled by laws. They were ruled by obligation, by debt, by the fear of being seen as one who takes and does not return. And those who mastered that fear ruled, without throne, without title, without mercy. People claimed favors to ruin rival families. In the medieval world, loyalty was rarely a choice. It was a trap. And every favor carried the weight of allegiance. Because sometimes, a noble wouldn't help you out of kindness. He helped you so he could own you. So that one day when the time was right, he could make you choose between your life and someone else's ruin. This is how favors were weaponized. Not for gold, not for war, but for power. You're a peasant. Your child is sick. Your crops have failed. Your days from starvation. And just when you think you'll lose everything, a nobleman you barely know rides through and offers help. Grain, medicine, protection. He says it's nothing. A gesture. You thank him. You survive. Years pass. Then one day, he returns. Not with food, but with a request. He's in a dispute with another noble, a land boundary, a contested river, a forest that both men claim. But here's the catch. You live near it. You've seen who hunted there. You've seen which banners flew. You know the truth. And the man who once saved your family says, "You owe me." He wants you to speak on his behalf, even if it's a lie, even if the other noble is right, even if the truth would save another family from ruin. But you can't say no, because if you do, you betray the man who once saved your life. And in a world where favors are sacred, that's worse than lying. It's treason. So you speak. You say what he tells you to say. You lie to the magistrate. You nod when he looks your way. And with that lie, his rival loses the land. Maybe it's a border. Maybe it's an inheritance. Maybe it's the only grazing ground a rival village depends on. But it's gone now. Because of you. Because of a favor. And the noble who helped you, he never cared about your child. He cared about leverage. Because every time he fed a poor man, or gave him shelter, or helped him avoid punishment, it wasn't charity. It was investment. And when enough peasants owed him, he could control narratives, control borders, control rival families. One peasant's lie might be dismissed, but 5, 10, a whole row of people saying, "We saw it, we swear it, this land was always his." That changed everything. And when you dig through medieval land disputes, you find this pattern over and over. Sudden testimonies from poor villagers, mysterious claims that shift power from one family to another. And behind those testimonies, a network of favors called in like soldiers. Sometimes people protested. They said, "We don't want to be involved." But nobles didn't ask. They reminded you of what they did. They said, "Would your son have survived without me?" They said, "I protected you from the sheriff." They said, "You were nothing before I helped you." And suddenly your honor, your life, your future belonged to their cause. Some families were destroyed this way. One false witness from a trusted villager could undo generations of land ownership. And once the land was gone, the power followed. Political alliances shifted. Marriages fell through. Rival houses collapsed, not from battle, but from stories. Strategically placed stories spoken from the mouths of men who once knelt at the feet of the very nobles they were now helping betray others. And the worst part? You still thanked them, because your family lived, because you still had bread, because the price of that favor might have been your voice. But your children still had a home, and that felt like a fair trade, but was it? How many lives were wrecked so you could survive? How many truths were broken so your debt could be paid? This is the quiet violence of medieval power. Not the sword, not the gallows, but the favor. The unspoken bond that turns commoners into weapons, that turns gratitude into blackmail, that forces you to choose between justice and survival. And what's terrifying is this: you weren't the only one. Hundreds of others made the same choice. Because one noble helping 10 peasants could ruin an entire family line 2 generations later. The weight of those favors was a time bomb, set to explode not in blood, but in silence, in a courtroom, in a moment of hesitation where you say what you're told, not because it's true, but because you owe, and the lie becomes law. The land changes hands, and no one ever sees the blade. Your children might be taken as hostages until you repaid. In the brutal logic of the medieval world, promises weren't backed by contracts. They were backed by flesh. When you owed someone a debt of money, of land, of loyalty, your word wasn't always enough. Sometimes they took your children, not as slaves, not as ransom, but as hostages of honor, a living guarantee that you would repay what you owed. And if you failed, if the harvest failed, or your strength gave out, or war blocked the road, your children might never come home. This wasn't a rare punishment. It was a system, one practiced by kings and warlords, nobles and clergy, across continents and centuries. A system that weaponized family bonds to enforce loyalty, obedience, and submission. In feudal Europe, especially during the 11th to 14th centuries, hostages were a routine part of high-stakes agreements. A noble seeking military aid or protection might offer his son to a rival lord, not as a prisoner, but as a guest under guard. If the favor was honored, the child would be returned. But if not, that child could be kept for years, or used as leverage, or worse, executed as a message. But it didn't just happen to nobles. It happened to farmers, to tradesmen, to desperate families trying to survive. You ask a wealthy landowner for seed during a famine. He agrees, but insists on a guarantee. You offer livestock, but it's not enough. So you offer something more valuable, your eldest son. You swear he'll be safe. It's only for a season, just until the debt is repaid, but the harvest fails. Or the landlord changes his terms, or war breaks out, and suddenly your child's return is no longer promised. Because in the cold machinery of obligation, your child has become collateral, a breathing contract, and they know it. In parts of the Middle East, under tribal law, similar systems existed. A favor given during wartime, a safe passage, a supply of weapons, might be secured by taking a son or daughter into custody. The family who owed the debt would never flee, never betray, because to do so meant sacrificing their own blood. In imperial China, hostages were used as instruments of control not only in diplomacy, but in peasant land deals. If a family received help from a regional lord, they might be required to send a child to be raised in the lord's house, as a servant, an adopted ward, or an emotional insurance policy. In many cases, the hostage was treated well, educated, clothed, fed. But make no mistake, this was not charity, this was leverage. The child's comfort was a reflection of how well the favor was being honored. If the parent faltered, so did the child's safety. And everyone knew. Villages knew which families had children under promise. You could see it in the eyes of mothers who wept silently during prayer, in fathers who labored twice as long in the fields, knowing each missed payment could mean a letter telling them their daughter would not be coming back. And for the children, it was confusion, displacement, trauma. Some were told they were being honored, chosen, sent to live with lords, monks, or knights. But beneath the words, they understood. They were bargaining chips, tokens of trust, traded without consent. And when the favor was repaid, when the father delivered the grain or the mother repaid the coin, sometimes the child came home, other times they didn't. Sometimes the Lord said, "They've grown fond of us, let them stay another year." Sometimes the child had already been married off, or entered religious service, or died from disease, and sometimes the debt was never considered truly repaid, because power loves to extend its terms. And so, a favor granted in kindness could become a life sentence for someone who never asked to be part of it. This practice wasn't just cruel, it was effective, because there is no force more powerful than a parent's fear. Lords, bishops, kings, they understood this, that fear could control people longer and more reliably than violence ever could. So instead of swords, they took sons. Instead of taxes, they took daughters. And instead of written contracts, they took hearts and squeezed. In time, this practice would be outlawed, replaced by written codes, legal enforcement, and centralized justice. But for centuries, a single favor could cost you your child. And if you broke the bond, you didn't just risk disgrace. You risked losing the person you loved most, forever. You could be forced to work on holy days in violation of law. In the medieval world, laws were clear. The Sabbath was sacred. Holy days were not to be touched. No plowing, no threshing, no labor. God rested, and so should you. But sometimes, man's law and God's law collided. Because when you owed someone a favor, their word could override heaven itself. And if the person who helped you came calling on a holy day, you worked, even if the church forbade it, even if it meant risking penance, punishment, or worse. This was the brutal reality of favor-bound life, a world where returning a favor meant doing what you were told, when you were told, no matter what day it was. In rural villages, where survival balanced on a blade's edge, obligation often mattered more than scripture. A noble who lent you a mule to save your harvest might later summon you to repair a bridge on a feast day. A merchant who gave your wife medicine might demand your help loading carts on Easter morning, and a local healer who saved your child from fever might ask you to gather herbs on a Sunday. And you went, because to refuse was betrayal, to delay was insult, and to appeal to the church, that was seen as cowardice. Even the clergy knew the conflict. Local priests turned a blind eye more often than not, because they too were entangled in the web of favors, and they understood. A man standing in the village could collapse faster than any sermon could save it. The laws were strict. Canonical texts across Europe forbade labor on Sundays and religious festivals. Violators could be fined, excommunicated, or forced to do public penance. In some regions, even whippings were given for repeated Sabbath violations. But still, people worked, not out of greed, out of debt. Because a favor wasn't just a kind gesture. It was a binding rope around your life. And when it pulled, you followed, even if it dragged you across sacred ground. In 13th century England, records show men conscripted by local lords to repair roads on Ascension Day. In Spain, farmers were forced to tend to noble vineyards during Corpus Christi. In parts of Poland, entire village crews labored through Christmas Eve to complete construction for a bishop's estate because the bishop had once sent grain during a drought. They didn't want to. They knew the risk. But they owed something. And that debt was more feared than the church's wrath, because the church punished your soul. But your village? It punished your life. A man who refused to return a favor, no matter the day, could be shunned. Neighbors would stop speaking. Your children would be left out of games. The butcher might forget to offer you the best cuts. The miller might suddenly raise your fee, and once your name was stained as disloyal, you carried that mark like a curse, even if you told them it was the Sabbath. I was following God's law, they would reply. And what about the man who saved your land from flooding, who stood beside you when no one else did? You owe him more than rules written in a book. This wasn't heresy, it was hierarchy. Because in many villages, favor was its own religion, and breaking that bond was its greatest sin. Sometimes people tried to split the line. They would work in secret, plow by moonlight, repair tools at dawn, hide their labor behind hedges or barns. But if they were caught, they answered to both priest and patron, and the shame was doubled. One German chronicle tells of a young man asked to repair a noble's cart on a sacred fast day. He refused. He cited church law. He even wept in the chapel, asking God to help him choose. The next day the nobleman spread word. His family was ungrateful, disloyal, not to be trusted. Within a week their thatch was stolen, their pigs were let loose, and no one came to help during the next storm. The young man eventually did the work, but the damage was done. He had chosen God over man, and man had punished him for it. This is the dark irony. In a world dominated by faith, it was social debt, not divine command, that often decided behavior. Because when your belly was empty, when your crops depended on help, when your children's safety hung on a neighbor's goodwill, your moral compass bent under pressure, and you learned early on that heaven might forgive you, but your village would not. So the next time you picture the quiet holiness of medieval Sunday, the stillness, the bells, the folded hands, remember the men in the fields, the women hauling water, the boy hammering under his breath. Not because they didn't believe, but because they couldn't afford to say no. Because one favor, long ago, still whispered in their ears, work, or everything you love will disappear. Characters, 5,181. If you died before repaying a favor, your soul was considered damned. In the ancient world, a favor wasn't just a debt of honor, it was a spiritual chain. And if you died before repaying it, that chain could drag your soul into the fire. For much of medieval Europe, the boundaries between spiritual law and social obligation were blurred, if not fused. A promise made to a benefactor, especially when sworn in the name of God, before a priest or upon a holy relic, was not simply an agreement between two people. It was a sacred vow, a covenant of the soul, and to break it, or worse, to die with it unpaid, was to die stained, condemned, unready to meet the eyes of God. The doctrine of purgatory, refined and fiercely preached from the 12th century onward, held that the soul of the dead must be cleansed before it could enter heaven. But some stains weren't accidental sins. They were breaches of sacred duty, debts of gratitude, oaths unfulfilled. Theologians wrote of souls tethered to the world by weighty promises, souls that wandered the earth in restless agony, denied entrance to paradise. These weren't murderers or thieves, but men who died before returning a favor. A knight who swore to repay his savior, but fell in battle before he could. A widow who vowed to protect her benefactor's child, but died in childbirth. A farmer who borrowed a mule in famine and promised help in return, but never delivered. In each case, the church taught that the soul would not rest. It would hover in torment, sometimes seen as a cold wind in the village, a moaning at the church doors, a shadow on the road, until the favor was repaid by someone else, or the debt forgiven through divine mercy. And mercy was rare. In 13th century France, monasteries recorded testimonies of peasants who claimed to see the same figure standing at the edge of their fields every dusk. A man who had drowned 3 years earlier, rumored to have sworn on a relic to return a favor before his death. His soul, they said, was trapped. He walks, wrote one monk, because his debt walks with him. In England, Some churchyards banned the burial of individuals suspected to have died with unfulfilled oaths. These were not criminals, but those who had made a promise, especially one bound to God, and failed to complete it. They were buried at the edge of consecrated ground, close enough for hope, but far enough to show shame. To swear an oath before a relic, such as the bones of a saint, a piece of the true cross, or even a page from Scripture, was common among nobility and clergy alike. It made the promise binding not just in life, but in death. And to fail such an oath meant your soul might bypass purgatory and descend directly into punishment. One terrifying example survives from 15th century Poland. A nobleman, spared during a battle, promised to build a chapel in honor of the saint, whose relic had been present when he was saved. But years passed, and the chapel was never built. After his sudden death, locals claimed to see a figure burning, screaming, chained to the very land where the chapel should have stood. The church didn't just tolerate these stories, they used them. Priests warned congregations that favors, when sworn in sacred places or witnessed by God's servants, were spiritually binding. Breaking them didn't just offend men, it offended heaven, and heaven did not forget. In Italy, Dominican friars preached sermons titled Debitum Animae, the debt of the soul. They spoke of men dragged down by kindnesses they never repaid, women who died during childbirth, after promising pilgrimage but never departing, souls who wandered Rome, their eyes weeping blood, until another took on their task and penance. And so, repayment of favors became not just honorable, but holy. To complete a dead man's oath was to help free his soul. Some pilgrims, especially in Spain and Germany, traveled not for their own salvation, but on behalf of others, friends, family, or total strangers whose spirits had appeared to them in dreams, begging for the debt to be repaid. These weren't superstitions. These were canonically supported actions, sanctioned by local bishops. The theology was brutal. A soul must be clean before entering heaven. And an unpaid debt, especially one sworn before God, left it filthy. Even in death, the chain of favor held tight. In Scandinavia, sagas tell of restless ghosts who walk because of honor debts, a warrior whose life was saved but who never avenged his benefactor, a shield maiden who failed to protect a dying comrade's family. These spirits became Draugr, unquiet dead, cursed not for evil, but for failure to repay. And in some cases, the family of the debtor would inherit the task, not out of tradition, but to save the soul of the deceased. Fathers would beg sons, "If I die before returning his gift, you must do it for me. I cannot face judgment with this weight." And the son, terrified not only of his father's damnation, but of his own future debts, would carry out the favor, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later, but always with fear. Because in that world, your soul wasn't judged just by what you took, but by what you failed to return. This belief etched itself into law, culture, and even tombstone inscriptions. Some graves begged God to release a soul still in debt. Others pleaded with the living, "Fulfill my vow and set me free." So the next time someone says, "You owe them nothing," history whispers another answer. Once, a favor wasn't just a social debt. It was a spiritual shackle, one that followed you into the grave, and if you died before repaying it, your soul didn't rest. You might be summoned to court to repay a favor as legal obligation. You thought it was kindness. A noble offered your family protection during a raid, let your livestock graze on his land during drought, or whispered to the magistrate not to punish your brother too harshly. There was no document, no signature, no fee, just a favor. But in the eyes of the realm, that favor was now a contract, and if you failed to return it, you could be summoned to court, not for theft, not for violence, but for ingratitude, treated as a breach of legal obligation. In some medieval and early modern kingdoms, especially in parts of feudal France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, favors, once given and acknowledged, could carry the same legal weight as debt. The noble had helped you. You accepted. And now, he had the right to demand repayment. And if you refused, he had the right to take you to court. There, your defense couldn't be, "I didn't ask for help." It couldn't be, "I didn't know it would come to this." Because your silence, your continued benefit from that favor, was considered consent. In court, the noble might speak first. He'd say, 3 years ago, I provided grain to this man's family. I kept his eldest son from conscription. In return, he promised me a season's labor, or 2 goats, or assistance during the harvest. You might deny the agreement ever happened, but witnesses could be called, villagers who remembered your father thanking the Lord at Mass, a priest who blessed the noble's gift publicly, a cousin who overheard your promise to repay him tenfold. And suddenly, the case was not about friendship. It was about honor, proof, and repayment. The judge, or in many cases the local bailiff or steward, might rule against you. And the punishment? It varied. Sometimes you'd be ordered to repay in goods, grain, labor, livestock. Sometimes land was seized. If you had nothing, your name was recorded publicly as a debtor. You might be barred from certain trades, taxed more heavily, or even pressed into forced work for a season. Because in these systems, a favor was not a gift. It was a legal bond, one you couldn't walk away from. In the Hungarian kingdom, 15th century records show nobles initiating lawsuits against peasants for failing to repay acts of goodwill. One man was ordered to give up his only ox after declining to help rebuild a road financed by a baron who had once protected his land. The baron claimed repayment had been agreed upon by honor, and that was enough. The peasant's ox was seized because the court ruled what is pledged in honor, if not repaid, turns to debt. Even in England, during certain feudal periods, a lord could claim a customary duty if he had provided assistance to a tenant in crisis. The favor became precedent, and precedent, in the eyes of law, became expectation. And expectation, when unmet, became liability. It wasn't only nobles who used this system. In Italian merchant courts, wealthy families who once helped struggling tradesmen would later file formal petitions demanding repayment in the form of partnerships, apprenticeships, even marriage proposals, treating a favor given decades earlier as the foundation of a legal obligation. These weren't frivolous lawsuits. They were often upheld, because the courts weren't just enforcing written law, they were enforcing social memory. They were protecting the glue that held unstable communities together, the silent network of favors, promises, debts, and oaths that everyone relied on. If people could accept favors and walk away without consequence, what would happen to trust? That was the court's logic. So when you stood there, humiliated, being told you owed a debt you never thought would follow you, you were not a criminal. You were just someone who forgot how the game was played. In Normandy, records survive of entire families being dragged into court to settle favor debts. A father accepts protection for his land, dies. Years later, his son is summoned to fulfill the obligation, because honor was hereditary. A favor unfulfilled by one generation passed to the next, and if the family couldn't repay, their name became tarnished, their access to markets restricted. Their daughters might be deemed unworthy of respectable marriage, all because someone long ago accepted a kindness and failed to repay it. You see, in these societies, favors were not acts of generosity, they were traps, offers laced with future cost, politely phrased, but legally binding. You could say yes in a moment of desperation and pay for it years later, in court. Even kings weren't exempt. If a noble supported the throne during a crisis, lent ships, troops, or silence, he might come back decades later and demand a province, a title, or a royal marriage. And if the monarch refused, the court became a battleground, because unpaid favor was political betrayal, and in every dusty corner of every old legal archive across Europe, there are records, scrolls, parchments, faded ink, of men and women pulled before judges not for what they stole, but for what they failed to return. Not gold, but gratitude. Even rescuing someone could make you their lifetime guardian. In the modern world, saving someone makes you a hero. But in the medieval world, it could make you a prisoner, because sometimes, the moment you pulled someone from a river, lifted them from beneath a collapsed cart, or stopped their bleeding on the battlefield, your life stopped being your own. You became theirs, not in gratitude, but in obligation, in law, in chains of social duty you never agreed to. Because rescuing someone in that time, especially a stranger, wasn't always an act of mercy. It could be a trap, a moment of courage that bound you for life. You see, saving a life wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, it was moral, and, in some cases, it was legal. There were customs, unwritten and in some places formalized, where the rescuer became responsible for the one they saved, not just that day, but for their future, their debts, their behavior. If they had nowhere to go, you took them in. If they were wounded, you fed and clothed them. If they committed a crime years later, you might be called to answer for it. Because your act of rescue wasn't just mercy, it was considered a kind of adoption, and that meant ownership, duty, guardianship, and there was no paperwork to back out, no signature to erase it, just the eyes of your village, your lord, your priest, all watching to see if you fulfilled your bond. Imagine you're walking along a riverbank. You see a man drowning. You wade in, pull him out. He survives. At first, he's thankful. He calls you a savior. But he's not from your village. He has no home, no family. And now, everyone looks at you. You brought him back. He belongs to you now. He stays in your home, eats your food, and when he falls into trouble, when he steals or gets into a fight or takes out a loan he can't repay, they don't go to him. They go to you. Because in that moment of rescue, you inherited his life and every burden that came with it. There are records, scattered through monastic ledgers, village court transcripts, and oral traditions, of peasants and townsfolk who carried strangers for years after saving them. A woman who saved a boy from a collapsing roof later became his guardian after his parents died. A farmer who pulled a soldier from the mud during a skirmish was forced to house him indefinitely, until the soldier died, drunk, in a neighboring village, leaving behind a debt the farmer was pressured to pay. And if you tried to turn away, they said, "You shouldn't have saved him then. You chose to intervene. Now it's your problem." Sometimes this became noble. Sometimes these rescued lives became family, deep bonds forged from gratitude and shared struggle. But other times, it became suffocating, a lifetime of care you never asked for, a shadow that followed you long after the applause faded. In some cultures, especially where kinship and honor codes were strong, refusing to continue the bond was seen as worse than cruelty. It was betrayal, dishonor. You saved someone's life, only to throw it away when it became inconvenient. That marked you. And once marked, your name was whispered differently in the market, in the chapel, in the court. So, you carried the weight, because breaking the bond could be more dangerous than never saving them at all. Some people learned to avoid helping strangers altogether. They would look the other way, walk past an injured traveler, pretend they didn't hear the scream from the woods, not because they lacked compassion, but because they knew what it might cost. Saving a life in the wrong context could end yours in slow motion, through burden, through guilt, through a chain of obligations you could never shake free from. It wasn't just about saving someone from death. It was about inheriting their afterlife, the broken pieces they carried into the world once they breathed again, and those pieces often scattered into yours. That's why, in some places, rescues were carefully negotiated. The rescuer would bring the person to the church or town square and publicly hand them over, washing their hands of long-term duty. A ritual, a declaration. Because they knew that without that line, that clean break, mercy could become a life sentence. So, next time you imagine a medieval hero dragging someone from a burning barn or pulling them off the battlefield, don't just picture the applause. Picture the years that followed, the hungry mouth at their table, the legal summons, the theft they couldn't stop, the lie they were forced to defend. Because saving someone in that world, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a bond no one could sever. And sometimes, it was the beginning of a life that was no longer yours.